Hi, I'm George Lucas, and welcome to the behind-the-scenes Star Wars Special Edition.
Hi, my boy.
I'm Nabuki. I'm Nabuki.
This became a very long video because I realized it was a subject I needed to address on a few different fronts to say everything important about it. The video ended up being divided into 3 sections, so you can watch it in 3 installments if you want, but I don't want to post them separately because they're all interrelated. When I started making this video, I wasn't so interested in just pointing out all the different changes that have been made to the Star Wars movies over the years because I thought that had been done already, but I started to realize that it's never really been done completely. And while a lot of people are aware of certain more famous changes, there are a lot more that most people don't know about. I think looking at all of the changes, not just the big ones, starts to explain why the movies have changed over the years, and I decided that I'd like this to be the most comprehensive video that's ever been done about the changes to the movies. This is because I think that explaining the special editions is more than just looking at the changes, it's also understanding the story of why and how the changes were made, and I think looking at the smaller, less famous changes helps to do that. I want this to be the most complete look at the changes, but also the best examination of the reasons for them. Then of course there's also the story of the fan reactions to the changes, and why some of the changes have become so controversial. After the prequels and before the Disney era, by far the most controversial topic among Star Wars fans has been the fight over the special editions of the movies. Eventually it becomes a story about the fight over the ownership of all art.
I bet you have.
When I watched it, I realized, oh, it's different. And then I realized,
It hurts. It physically hurts you. It's like you're being force-fed someone else's memories instead of your own.
So yes, it's a small change, but it's a change that is informing the whole character.
Because, I mean, if you really look at the changes that he's making, I mean, first of all, they're really minute changes.
What I can't understand is why he would make little tiny changes.
I don't want things to change.
But you can't stop the change, any more than you can stop the suns from setting.
The first misconception about the special editions that I want to debunk is the idea that people have of the original versions of the movies that they like to return to, because the truth is that no such thing actually exists, and it never has. To explain what I mean by that, first I'm going to go through the history of the movies and list just how many different versions of the movies there actually have been over the years. Before the first Star Wars was ever released, there was another version that the public saw at test screenings that was still missing some effects shots and a final sound mix, and although that was a version that the public saw, for this list I'm going to limit myself to versions that were out after the official release. Even then though, the thing is that in the initial limited release, the first version that was out there contained a handful of special effects shots that were changed when the film went into wide release on more screens afterward. Now, these were small things like different laser blasts and flash frames in one shot, different compositing in the establishing shot of the Rebel base, and differences to Yavin Prime as it's seen from the base. They are changes though, and they were out there after the film was officially released. So I'm considering the initial limited release version the first version, and then what you saw in wide release would have been different. So technically your first special edition of A New Hope happened in 1977, but even after that, in the wide release, there still wasn't just one version. Even in its initial original wide release, A New Hope still had several different versions. There were versions in 35mm and 70mm and so on, but the differences between those versions weren't just the film. Creating sound mixes for the different theatrical sound systems at that time didn't just mean porting a stereo version directly over to a mono version. In each new version, important creative choices had to be made.
The fact is, the original Star Wars was mixed 3 different times because there were actually 3 different mixes that went out to the public. The first mix done was a 2-channel stereo Dolby mix, which hadn't been done before. It was a new process. That mix was done first because actually making prints and testing them out and getting theaters to tune up their equipment required that mix be done first. After that was done, then a 6-track stereo mix was done for the 70 millimeter release of the film. And of course, going back and mixing the film a second time, one makes changes and you take things a little further. You've learned from the first mix of the movie, and you now go and make all your changes in the next mix, which was the 6-track. And that mix went out, and that was what people heard in the 70 millimeter releases of the film. Then there was a third mix done, which is a monaural mix. Now, at the time, most theaters, the majority of theaters, were just monaural. They would play, all the sound would play through one speaker behind the screen. And so it was important that we address the requirements of those theaters since they were in a majority. And so a third mix of the film was done, which was combining everything monaurally into one channel. And there were changes made in that mix because each time we'd come back to it, George Lucas would listen to the film and look at it and have a few new ideas, and some things would get changed and added in. So what the public heard in 1977, depending on what theater you went to see it in and hear it, you may have heard a different mix. And there are differences, some differences in voices, some differences in sound effects, either present or absent. Not really any music changes, but there were changes in the relationship of music and effects and dialogue.
So there were actually a total of 3 distinct sound mixes, but the stereo and surround versions were more similar to each other, and the major changes mostly existed between those versions and the mono version. So to simplify, I'm just going to call it 2 versions and refer to the stereo version and the mono version. The mono version that was out in the original release is usually considered more complete, as most theaters at the time would have shown this version, and more work was done to it. It was finished last because other versions had to be finished first to allow for more complicated technical preparations. So the differences in the mono version were changes made to those 2 earlier versions. The differences between the stereo and mono versions weren't minor sound mixing things, though. On the mono version, there were a number of sound effects and alien voices and even whole lines of dialogue that weren't there in the stereo version.
It would be as well to let it go. It's too far out of range. Not for long. It would be as well to let it go. It's too far out of range. Not for long.
All right, check this side of the street. All right, check that side of the street. The door's locked. Move on to the next one. It's secure. Move on to the next one.
You'll try to make the precise location appear on the monitor. You'll try to make the precise location appear on the monitor. The tractor beam is coupled to the main reactor in 7 locations. A power loss at one of the terminals will allow the ship to leave.
Open the blast door. Open the blast door. Close the blast door.
So again, these aren't just minor aesthetic differences. These were changes as major as having a completely different voice actor for Aunt Beru.
Luke, tell Uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Bocce. Luke, tell Uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Bocce.
Where are you going?
Where are you going?
Oh, and he can't stay here forever. Most of his friends have gone. It means so much to him.
Oh, and he can't stay here forever. Most of his friends have gone. It means so much to him.
Luke's just not a farmer, Owen. He has too much of his father in him.
Luke's just not a farmer, Owen. He has too much of his father in him.
He said he had some things to do before he started today, so he left early.
Oh, did he take those 2 new droids with him?
I think so.
He said he had some things to do before he started today, so he left early.
Oh, did he take those 2 new droids with him?
I think so.
So for the sake of counting versions here, let's say that in the wide release after the limited release version, there were 2 more versions of A New Hope that you might have seen during the initial release, the mono wide release version and the stereo wide release version. You could technically say that there are more versions, but I'm simplifying. Those are the major groups of changes. So now we're up to 3 versions of Star Wars from the initial release. Then a lot of people know A New Hope was changed again when it was reissued in 1981, with the title and the episode number being added to the opening crawl. So counting that, we're up to 4 distinct versions of A New Hope before Return of the Jedi ever even came out. Now, when it came to home video, even though the mono version had many things that were missing from the stereo version, going forward, most theaters and home video releases would be in stereo or surround sound, so the stereo version was the basis for most of the versions you would hear after that. The voice actor for Aunt Beru that you hear now was originally in the stereo version, while most of the alien voices and additional dialogue from the mono version have been added back in. So the sound that you hear if you watch the movie after 1977 is actually a 4th version of the sound mix that combines elements and changes from the mono version back into the stereo version. And then, of course, as sound systems changed again over the years, there were new sound mixes that were permutations on the 4th version. Ben Burtt has remixed the sound on the movies many more times for different formats, but each of those remixes either didn't have major changes and additions, or they were also accompanied by editorial and special effects changes, so I won't count any more sound remixes as distinct versions. Also, of course, you could say that the cropped pan and scan versions on VHS are very different, and the way the films looked remastered for Laserdisc is very different from those versions, but I'm only going to count major new permutations, and in those releases the movie wasn't really edited and the special effects weren't changed, so we'll skip those releases and go up to 1997. I'll count the theatrical special edition as the next version.
For an entire generation, people have experienced Star Wars the only way it's been possible, on the TV screen. But if you've only seen it this way, you haven't seen it at all. Now, for its 20th anniversary, the adventure of a lifetime returns to the big screen in a way you've never seen before.
There'll be no one to stop us this time.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
With newly enhanced visual effects,
They're coming in too fast!
THX and digital sound, and a few new surprises.
Hanabuki. Bargonyanda.
We are simply delighted, of course, because only by seeing them on the big screen can you truly appreciate all the excitement and the terrible dangers that we faced. Yes, the humans faced them as well, but some young humans have never seen our story this way. Imagine. Older humans can relive the experience, but better.
So in 1997, Lucas decided to do a major theatrical re-release of the original trilogy, which they called the Special Edition. And this is where most people really started to become aware that the movies were changing. I should point out that when I show clips of the changes made to this version and to the DVD version after, if the change shot remained the same through to the current versions, in some cases I'm using a clip from the most recently remastered version as opposed to the 97 version or the DVD version, because the remastered picture quality is better than the preservations of those versions. The color timing might be slightly different, or the compositing in the shot might be very slightly different in the remastered version, but for the purposes of the particular change I'm pointing out, it'll be the same. In the cases where I'm doing this, I'll label the clip 1997 to present, or the date of the DVD to the present, to indicate that I'm using the most current remaster. 1997 was the 20th anniversary of the first film, but there were also several other reasons that Lucas decided to do a reissue, and that the reissue would feature changes to the film. Lucas has never made any secret of the fact that the production of the first Star Wars film was troubled, and that due to both technology and budget, he was never able to accomplish everything that he wanted.
They said I should say a few words about the making of this movie and how much fun it was. And I said I had nothing to say about that.
Was the making of the film, was it fun? You know, when we go to see it, it looks like, oh God, that must have been fun. Was it fun?
No, you can talk to Peter or Tony there. It wasn't very much fun.
Tony, what do you say? What do you say?
Well, I always say that George and I were the two unhappiest people on the set. There was a picture still of George sitting on some steps like this, looking so depressed. I actually want to go up and hug him and say, listen, it's okay.
This was made at a time in everyone's life when, you know, this was a very low-budget movie. It was a $10 million movie. It was, you know, I was reaching for the stars, and you had about so much money to get to Cleveland. You try to make the movie that you write as a script, and along the way you have to make a a large number of compromises. There's never enough time, never enough money. Some things just aren't possible. And so you have to rewrite, change, and in some cases cut things out that you'd planned to have in the movie. Whenever you do something that is creative and you end up having to rush through it and finish it before it's really completed the way you'd hope it be, it bothers you. And so there were a lot of things in Star Wars that bothered me a great deal because they weren't completed properly. And I've always wanted to have them finished. And I've wanted to do this ever since I did the movie. You know, if you go back and you check the interviews of when I made the movie and everybody said, oh, this is so wonderful. I said, well, it didn't turn out very well. It's only about 40% of what I wanted it to be. You know, I'm really disappointed in it. And every interview, relentlessly, right through the thing. And everybody said, what is he talking about? This guy's got to be crazy. And so obviously everybody who works with me has been hearing this for 20 years. As a matter of fact, I think they were relieved. Well, finally, he's going to do it. He's going to get it. We don't have to listen to this anymore. And, you know, the opportunity came along with the 20th anniversary celebration. I say, there were a lot of ideas bandied about what we were going to do.
In 1995, the restoration began with a concerted effort by 20th Century Fox, Lucasfilm, Skywalker Sound, and Industrial Light and Magic. The task was more daunting than anyone expected.
The most obvious thing that's happened is we've gone back to the original negative, cleaned it up considerably, redone a lot of the optical effects, the wipes, the dissolves, and improved the quality of the film because it was deteriorating. And I think this one had deteriorated a lot more than anybody expected in 20 years. So you're getting to see a brand new print that's very clean and is actually better than the original release.
This is one of the new tubes, and it's got a little speck of dirt on it. Let's see if I can get it off.
One of the things I wanted to do was preserve the film so that it could be still a viable piece of entertainment in the 21st century. And films, do deteriorate and they disappear.
Lucas's restoration and enhancement project took 3 years and $15 million. But Lucas is aware that some Star Wars purists might regard his changes as a desecration of a sacred work.
A few fans have actually expressed their, how can you do this? Well, from my point of view, it's a half-finished movie and I wanted to finish it. I've taken a lot of the special effects shots that weren't really as good as I'd hoped they would be because they were sort of prototype technology. And I've been able to improve them and just add that little difference. And I've done it with a lot of the end battle shots.
We took some of the scenes where in the dogfight sequences that the ships were sort of skidding or jumping incorrectly and they looked a little mechanical in their motions. And we redid those with computer graphic spaceships.
Well, with Mos Eisley, that was really one of the original shots, besides the Jabba the Hutt scene, that brought me back to try to rework the movie and try to improve the special effects. Because there was a scene right when the speeder is going in, right before it gets to the bar, that the effects were very bad on it. That there was a kind of a Vaseline blob that was under the speeder, and you couldn't see under the speeder, and it just looked terrible. It was one of the worst shots in the picture, and it really bugged me a great deal. And on top of that, Mos Eisley was supposed to be a city, and I never really was able to shoot more than a couple of streets. I had a very, very limited set in Jerba where I shot this, and a very little bit of time to shoot it in. And so I had just a couple of shots of streets. It was really the same shot used a couple different times. I always wanted Mos Eisley to be a big spaceport, and very exotic and a lot going on.
Mos Eisley Spaceport. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
So we designed a series of shots which show Mos Eisley in a much grander scale. We pull back and see the whole city. We see a lot more beasts of burden moving around in the city, more activity, and it just gives you a better sense of what Mos Eisley is.
We don't need to see his identification. Move along.
disgusting creatures. Go on. Go on. I can't understand.
In the original movie, in order to get dewbacks and things into the movie, we built a large rubber mannequin, really, that we were able to move around from set to set. He had a big stick in his head that somebody could sit alongside and move the head back and forth, and that was about as much movement as I could get out of it. You know, it was a very crude thing. I tried, again, to get as many different kinds of spaceships, robots, vehicles, animals as I could possibly fit into the movie. And I was always very frustrated about the fact that I couldn't get the dewbacks to actually move or do anything. They were just basically big rubber statues. I wanted to give a kind of random, real-world feel to everything. So I wanted to do some things that weren't predictable, like having stormtroopers ride on dewbacks. But we decided that we would restore the films, and I realized that I had an opportunity to fix a lot of the problems that I'd had when I first finished the film. I looked at the film and began to pull all the old thorns out of my side, one of which was the dewbacks and the fact that the dewbacks couldn't walk. And I always wanted them to have movement and walk around and be part of the population of the film.
Someone was in the pod. The tracks go off in this direction.
Well, when I first shot the scene with Jabba the Hutt, I knew I was going to create some kind of stop-motion creature to be Jabba the Hutt. I didn't, at that point, have a creature designed. I had to have somebody, an actor, play the part, so Harrison had somebody to play against. So we just picked a big guy and put him in a fuzzy vest. I, at that point, felt that he may be a character somewhat like Chewbacca, a big furry character. We shot that. As we were cutting the movie, realized relatively quickly that we didn't have the time or the money to actually shoot that scene, that ILM was pressed way beyond what it could pull off as it was. So I had to abandon that sequence pretty early on. As I came up to the 20th anniversary, I was very keen to put Jabba the Hutt in. By that time on Jedi, we had redesigned Jabba the Hutt, and we had a better version of Jabba, so that I knew exactly what Jabba looked like and how he should fit in there. One of the things that happened when I changed from a big furry Jabba the Hutt to a big slug-like Jabba the Hutt is the new design for Jabba the Hutt that had this big long tail, and he was very slug-like. So when I went to shoot the scene, the original scene with Han, he turns and walks around Jabba the Hutt. When I put the slug-like Jabba the Hutt in there, it's obvious that Han would have to have walked over his tail in order to get to the other side. So I said to Steve and everybody, I thought what we should try to do is basically punch Han out, move him up, make it look like he's walking over his tail. So, I mean, it's really something that grows out of the reality of it.
Right here, Jabba. Been waiting for you.
When I made the first film, Star Wars, not only were we making a movie, a very ambitious movie, but we were trying out technology that had never been done before, and especially in the space battle, where we were trying to get ships to fly against backgrounds, and we were using motion control cameras and things that just had never been done before. So part of what we were doing was a prototype of a new type of filmmaking, and part of it was telling the story. A lot of the storytelling had to be sacrificed because of the limitations of the technology that we had at that point, which was just brand new kind of prototype. We were inventing it as we were going. And the shots didn't have the kind of dynamics that I was hoping it would have. Most of the new shots that we've created are much more lively in terms of the dynamics of the shot. The ships are bigger in frame, they move further away, or they come closer and over camera. Sometimes we pan with the ships, which we couldn't do before. There's a lot of new things that we're able to put in there that makes the shots much more exciting and much more sophisticated.
Open main launch tubes. Main launch tubes opening, sir.
I don't believe it. Hey, how are you? Great. How'd you get it? Hey, you coming up with
I'll be right up there with you, and if I got stories to tell you...
You sure you can handle this shit?
Sir, Luke is the best bush pilot in the Outer Rim territories.
You'll do all right.
Thank you, sir. I'll try. I gotta get aboard. We'll hear all your stories when we get back, all right?
Right. Hey, Biggs. I told you I'd make it someday.
It'll be like old times, Luke. You'll never stop us.
People tend to notice the really obvious changes to the movie, like this deleted scene with Biggs that was added back into the movie. But while there's been a lot of debate over some of these major changes, the majority of the things changed in the special editions were small fixes that most people will never even notice. Going through the films frame by frame to look for these smaller changes, you start to find interesting things. For one thing, although many of the effects shots in the Death Star trench run were enhanced, if you sync it up to the original version to compare the two, you'll find that the entire movie from after the reinstated Biggs scene until the start of the end credits has an identical number of frames now to what it had in 1977. There's only one shot that's been made slightly longer than the original version, and to make it fit, Lucas cut into the shots before and after it to do that so that the total number of frames in the sequence is still the same. Contrary to the idea that people have of Lucas just recklessly hacking away at the films and not being mindful of the effects that the changes have, he's actually very mindful of not disturbing the editing and pacing, and he's going through these scenes frame by frame. That's why you get fans upset over changes that are really only changes to a few frames. For an example, in the shots where he edited out some frames of Imperial troopers getting hit by blasters, he did it by adding a few frames onto the end of the preceding shot so that the number of frames in the sequence is identical. But like I already said, in spite of the subsequent escalating backlash, the special editions were mostly positively received at the time when they came out.
The re-release of Star Wars has already earned nearly $70 million in just 3 weeks.
As of today, it is the #1 box office attraction of all time in the U.S. and Canada. Sometime last night, Star Wars became the first movie to blow past the $400 million mark.
It's more than a movie. It is an event.
Now there's an even better one, a new and improved Star Wars.
Boasting refurbished footage, sassed-up special effects, and even a new scene or two, the Star Wars re-release, to be followed in turn by the other movies in Lucas's trilogy, 1980's The Empire Strikes Back and 1983's Return of the Jedi, more than lives up to its special edition tag.
This Star Wars special edition boasts new special effects and added scenes to the delight of fans who came out in full force to cheer the premiere.
Mark's amazed by the success of the special edition.
That premiere surprised me. I mean, the wave of positive feeling coming from the grandstands after all these years.
George Lucas is my hero, I'll tell you.
Star Wars Special Edition continues to amaze Hollywood with its stellar success. In some cities, the opening night for The Empire Strikes Back has already sold out.
Yes!
So, George, when you were like kind of sitting at home and you saw the kind of news response to the opening of Star Wars several weeks ago, did you think Shazam? What did you think?
I don't know. I mean, it's very strange. It's like being in the Twilight Zone. It's like, it's not just the reissue, it's like a revisiting of the entire event.
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't expect this to happen.
I think the outrage at the changes increased over time for a couple of reasons. First, I think somehow at the time people got this idea that these changes would just be temporary and an alternate optional version of the movie and that they'd eventually get the other version again. But Lucas had already been saying for years when the special editions came out that this wasn't the case.
3 timeless adventures that changed movie making forever. Now the entire trilogy, digitally mastered in THX for the ultimate in sound and picture quality. This will be your last chance to own the original version of Star Wars.
The original version of Star Wars on video. Buy it before it's gone forever.
The original Star Wars trilogy on video. One last time.
And George Lucas even makes a veiled threat on the back where he says,
you know, he calls it the final video release.
The final video release in its original
version.
Yeah.
In the years before the internet was so ubiquitous, people didn't have as much access to information about the changes to A New Hope that had been made over the years. And if they had heard of other audio mixes in the theater or whatever, that had been years ago, and they only had vague memories of it. So their idea of Star Wars was basically one consistent version up until 1997, even though that wasn't the case. And then they thought that the 1997 special edition was something completely new. new, rather than thinking of the movie as being gradually changed at many points. But in addition to that, it also seemed to me that the outrage over the special edition seemed to get a lot worse with the release of The Phantom Menace. The backlash to The Phantom Menace was mostly from older fans that had been kids when the original trilogy had first come out, and who were now adults and hoping for Star Wars to recreate the feelings in them that they had when they were kids. When The Phantom Menace didn't, this was where the idea really started to set in that Lucas had changed and he didn't know what he was doing anymore, when of course I think it's obvious that it was the fans who had changed. But to support this new idea that Lucas was no longer fit to manage Star Wars, the changes made in the special editions provided another convenient example that Star Wars used to be one thing, and now suddenly Lucas was changing it into something different. But as far as the list that I'm making here, the point is that while people think that the special editions were the dividing line where the movies were changed, we're actually up to the 5th version of A New Hope when we get to 1997. Then of course, when the movies came out on DVD in 2004, there was another round of changes.
This holiday, the Star Wars trilogy is now on DVD for the very first time. Wonderful! You can be a part of the adventure in all 3 movies, plus a bonus 4th disc. This holiday, you can bring the Force to your DVD collection. The Star Wars trilogy, rated PG.
For generations, only one trilogy has been the heart of every movie collection. Now, it will be again. The Star Wars trilogy on DVD.
Wake up. We stopped. Wake up.
Lou, tell Uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Bocce. Lou, tell your uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Bocce.
There's no one here.
In 2004, for the first DVD release of the original trilogy, Lowry Digital created a new 2K scan of the film. I think most people probably know this, but when I'm talking about 2K and 4K, I'm talking about the resolution of the image and how many pixels of information there are in a frame. Blu-rays are normally at a resolution of 1080p, which is a little bit smaller than a 2K scan, so for a standard DVD in 2004, a 2K scan was more than sufficient. The interesting thing about the changes made to the 2004 DVD version of the original trilogy is that Lucas was concurrently working on Revenge of the Sith, and you can see that the changes he was making were about tying the 6 episodes together. When he was filming Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones, he actually had his mind on collecting bits for all 6 movies. So he did things like having Tamara Morrison record Boba Fett's lines for Empire Strikes Back, and Ian McDiarmid refilmed the scene in Empire Strikes Back where the Emperor was originally played by another actor. He actually filmed the last scene in Revenge of the Sith while they were filming Attack of the Clones, so that they wouldn't have to rebuild the Lars Homestead set again for just a few shots. During Revenge of the Sith, he also got a bit of footage of Hayden Christensen as Anakin that he could use for Return of the Jedi and so on. During this period, he wasn't just working on any one episode at a time. He was in the home stretch of a nearly 3-decade project, and he was always gathering little bits he needed for all 6 episodes to make it all into one larger piece. The changes made to A New Hope in this version were mostly small things, like replacing some lettering on displays with Aurebesh versions, which again was to make it more consistent with the other movies. In the Death Star cell block, the hallway was originally extended with a forced perspective backdrop that looked very fake at some angles, so that was replaced. In the Twin Sunset scene, the clouds and outline of a mountain were changed to make the suns consistent from shot to shot. Maybe the most noticeable thing that he did here was to replace Jabba the Hutt with an upgraded CGI version based on the character as he appeared in The Phantom Menace. The color timing throughout was also altered, seemingly to bring it more in line with the colors of the prequels, and the new skin and the changes to the colors did create some issues with lightsabers and some of the effects like that, most of which would be fixed again in later versions. After the 2004 DVD, in 2006 there was also the DVD reissue of the original versions of the films, which was basically the same version as had been on the Laserdisc editions, so technically it was not a new permutation if I'm not counting the Laserdisc versions. But with The New Hope there was also another change to the Laserdisc version, where they replaced the 1981 version of the opening crawl with a version from a 1977 print. So technically this isn't the same as the Laserdisc or the 1981 version, so just to be complete, I'll call this version a new version in this case. Fans usually refer to this DVD version as the George Lucas original unaltered trilogy. Then for the Blu-ray release, the basis was the 2K digital intermediate that was created for the 2004 DVDs, and there was also another round of important changes. Overall, the changes were, again, mostly minor at this point, especially in A New Hope. But as we'll see, the fan reaction wasn't exactly proportionate to how much the films had actually been changed. And then after that, we have the 4K version. Now, the interesting thing with the 4K version is that it's not just a further iteration of the work done for DVD and Blu-ray. As the DVDs and Blu-rays were done from a 2K scan of the films, in order to create a true 4K version, they had to rescan the original film elements, which had been changed for the 1997 version. Since the digital special effects work that had been done in 1997 was mostly done at 2K resolution or less, in a lot of shots with multiple composited elements, they rescanned and recomposited the elements, and they also created new versions of the changes that had been done for the 2004 and 2011 releases, since those versions had also been done working with a 2K scan of the film. In the process of creating this new 4K version of the film, there were a number of new changes that crept in. Some of these were simply the result of recompositing things, where the new composite is a recreation of the same shot, but composed slightly differently. The opening logos for Fox and Lucasfilm have been changed again, as they have been changed several times before. If you want to get technical about it, there were also digital versions of all 6 movies released in 2015 after the sale of Lucasfilm to Disney, which had slightly different opening logos and alterations to the Fox fanfare, but I don't think that Lucas was involved in that in any way, and it seems like more of a legal department issue than a creative choice, so I wouldn't count those changes alone as being a new version of the film. But aside from the logos and recomposited shots, there are also a number of small intentional creative changes and fixes to the 4K version of the movie. A notable example is one shot where the sky behind 3PO has been changed. A different sky was put in when they recomposited it. In one of the shots where they had added rocks in front of R2 in 2011, they hadn't put a shadow from the rock before, and so now that shadow's been put in. In an establishing shot of the Lars homestead, for some reason before there was a transparent residual image of Luke visible where he shouldn't have been, and that's been changed in the 4K version. There was also a fly on the lens in one shot that's now been removed for the 4K. As another example of just how tiny some of these changes are, when they upgraded the CGI Jabba in 2004, for a couple frames of the wipe at the beginning of the scene, the tail of the 1997 Jabba version was still visible. So when they redid the scene in 4K, those frames were fixed. Some frames of Obi-Wan's lightsaber where before you could see the prop blade have now been covered with an animation element to match the other shots. So these kind of things aren't major changes, they're mostly just touching up tiny little things that might have slid by before, but which would now be much more visible in 4K. But they are changes though, and there are several of them. Aside from that kind of thing, in the 4K version of A New Hope, there's really only one real creative change. But I'm going to get to that later. So that would finish off the list of different versions of A New Hope for now, and I count a minimum of 9 distinct versions. The other episodes have histories that are slightly more streamlined, but not by much. In its original release, Empire Strikes Back also had several different or added effects shots in different versions. The 70mm version was finished first, and the longer lead time for the 35mm version allowed several changes to be made to it, although the two were released concurrently. I'm definitely counting these as 2 different versions, since some entire shots were missing from the 70mm that weren't added until the 35mm.
Empire was originally released in 70mm, and after seeing it a few times, George decided that the ending wasn't real clear. So he asked us to build a new, larger scale section of the medical frigate. We re-shot that sequence when the film was eventually released in 35mm. Apparently nobody knew that it had a new ending that was really different from the first one. It explained the relationship between the Falcon and the frigate.
We're ready for takeoff. Good luck, Mando. When we find Jabba the Hutt and that bounty hunter, we'll contact you. I'll meet you at the
There were effects changes like the hologram of the Emperor fading in gradually in the 35mm version, whereas it just appears fully in its first shot in the 70mm. There were also some alternate audio choices between the 70mm and 35mm, and again between the stereo and mono mixes. These range from alternate lines or sound effects to sound and dialogue that's missing completely in one of the versions.
Do take good care of yourself. Do take good care of yourself.
Oh, this is suicide.
There, that looks pretty good.
Oh, this is suicide. There's nowhere to go.
There, that looks pretty good.
Hello? Hello? How interesting. Hello? How interesting. interesting. If only you'd attached my legs, I wouldn't be in this ridiculous position. Oh dear, what now? I don't like the look of this. If only you'd attached my legs, I wouldn't be in this ridiculous position.
Additionally, on top of that, there was a 16mm version of the film made for charity screenings and other venues, which again did have a number of significant changes. So I think roughly I'm just going to count all of that as 3 versions that you could have possibly seen around the time of the original release of the movie. The pan and scan version for TV and VHS is again very different than the theatrical version, and the home video releases had their own new version of the sound, but I'll skip that again and count the 1997 version as version 4.
Once I started to redo the first film, it became such a good experience that I said, well, gee, we should go back and finish the other 2 films too. The monster that was developed originally didn't work, so I had to jettison that monster. I had Phil Tippett create a little tiny hand puppet, which we were able to use in 2 shots. It was just the head. And we just did it at the last minute to stick it in. But the rest of the sequence was sort of cut around the monster where you hear it, but you don't see it. And there's a certain creative way of doing that. I mean, you can do it where you don't see the monster, and some people would say that's more artistic than actually showing it. But in this particular case, I really wanted to see the monster, and I felt it would add more tension to the scene and make it more interesting. So we were able to do that. I was able to go back, create a better version of the monster, and shoot the scene and all the cutaways to the monster and add them into the scene, which I think makes that ice scene make more sense than it did before. The other issue was going into Cloud City. Cloud City was a very difficult thing to design and create originally as a floating city in the clouds. Some of the mat work there wasn't very good. And when they built the set, it's very confined. It's a very small set. It doesn't look out onto anything. It's just, you get this, it's a very claustrophobic kind of set. And that always bothered me. I wanted to be more open, see more of the city. And so what we've done is we've added to the approach of the city, similar to what we did with Mos Eisley in Star Wars. I mean, there's many more shots coming up to the city. You get to see more of the city. You get to see more speeders and those sorts of things. And then at the same time, when they land and they start walking through the city, now they walk through and there's large windows. You can see out and see more of the city. And it opens it up and makes it much larger.
Just like with A New Hope, there are a few large changes that are contentious, but there are also a lot of much smaller ones. Like, for example, for a few frames in the original version of this shot, the cloud car was originally in front of the Falcon by mistake rather than behind, and this was fixed in the special edition. Or in this shot of the Falcon, the extended on-ramp has been added in the special edition since it was down the last time you saw it and they never showed it being retracted. Also, like A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back also had many changes to the DVD version. The major changes to Empire Strikes Back for the DVD again mostly had to do with bringing it in line with the prequels and also with Return of the Jedi, with things like replacing the original hologram of the Emperor with a newly recorded version played by Ian McDiarmid, and having Tamara Morrison, the actor who played Jango Fett in the prequels, re-record Boba Fett's lines.
As you wish.
Lord Vader.
As you wish.
Lord Vader.
He's no good to me dead.
He's no good to me dead.
What if he doesn't survive? He's worth a lot to me.
What if he doesn't survive? He's worth a lot to me.
Put Captain Solo in the cargo hold.
Put Captain Solo in the cargo hold.
In shots of the Falcon cockpit from the front, the shots have been cropped more closely throughout, reportedly because Lucas was unhappy that Gary Kurtz had the cockpit set built larger for this movie than it had been in A New Hope. With the 2006 DVD reissue and the 2015 digital versions for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, there are no major changes other than to the opening logos, so I won't count either of those as different versions. But as with A New Hope, there was another round of changes made to Empire Strikes Back in the Blu-ray version. And then after the Blu-ray version, Empire Strikes Back also had 4K changes as well. These are minor, but they are there. Like with A New Hope, most of these changes are just slight things that resulted from recompositing elements of the film, but there are a couple distinct moments. For one, whereas the Emperor's hologram in the DVD and Blu-ray versions was nearly monochrome blue, now it has more visible color. They also replaced the explosion of the power generator on Hoth. On the Blu-ray, they had fixed a few frames of the Wampa's arm, where originally you could see the arm of the puppeteer. That change has been redone for 4K, but if you look closely now, you can see that the fur is different this time, so they did it again. It's a new version of the same change. So I'm counting the 4K as another distinct version, which makes 7 distinct versions in total of Empire Strikes Back. Return of the Jedi is the only one of the original trilogy that didn't have major differences in sound mixes or special effects between versions in its initial release, and after that its history is roughly the same as Empire Strikes Back. So using the same logic, we'll say that it has versions 1 theatrical, 2 1997, 3 DVD, 4 Blu-ray, and 5 4K.
Yes, I am here, your worshipfulness.
In the special edition, there was very little done to this movie. Most of the work was actually done in A New Hope, because that was the one that was made under the most stress, where we fell short of what I was really trying to get accomplished. And by the time we got down to this movie, there was very little that I didn't get accomplished that I wanted to get accomplished. And a lot of that has to do with the fact this is a much more personal story. I wasn't pushing the envelope technologically to try to tell a story that I couldn't tell, because the real focus of this is really the battle between Luke and his father. It's the emotional core of the picture.
With Return of the Jedi, the major changes mostly come down to the new musical number in Jabba's palace and the new celebration scene at the ending, both of which are complete departures from the original versions of those scenes. The Ewok celebration scene, I think, is probably the most significant, since it's the ending of the film and the ending of the trilogy, but also because the changes weren't just adding a few shots or putting in Hayden Christensen. The whole sequence has actually been completely re-edited. The only other scene in Return of the Jedi that has really had significant work done to it is the scene with Jabba's sail barge in the Sarlacc. This makes sense also because Lucas has talked about how the scene was one sequence that he wasn't ever totally happy with.
I'm not sure we ever really did it as well as we could have, but when you have so many different pieces of action that are supposed to be happening at exactly the same moment, you get into a very complex piece of cinema, which is editing things together that you want people to read, but you don't want to dwell on them for so long that it drags down a simultaneous moment. So I think there's always a kind of super reality that gets created in a moment like this, where you're stretching time and hoping that it doesn't look like that. In this case, we did it as well as we could, but I always had this nagging feeling that we could have done it better. It's a very delicate balance of having the audience be able to follow it and not having it look corny. Before, there was just a couple of tentacles, and there was kind of a funny mouth with a few spikes sticking out of it, but there wasn't anything alive about the whole thing. And so what we've managed to do is and create a kind of a beak that comes out and attacks him, and more tentacles, and it just looks much more realistic and much more threatening, which I think helps that scene considerably. Again, with this movie, we got a chance to expand the universe a bit, see more banthas than just one or two, see them in their natural environment. There's so little time in these movies to show the environments, because we're really pushing the story all the time, that it's always great when you get another opportunity to push the camera over here and say, oh, look what's over there.
The changes to the Sarlacc with the added beak were mostly just done to the existing shots as they were. In the end, there's only really one new shot, a reaction shot as the Sarlacc is hit by a blaster, and one longer shot where they first established the beak. Aside from them enhancing the Sarlacc, Lucas added some shots at the beginning to show off Tatooine a bit more. He recomposited some of the special effects and added new people to the top of the sail barge in a few shots, because how the people up there were composited in it before made them just kind of look like black blobs. Shadows under the skiff and sail barge were improved at points. In one shot, he added a bit more motion to one of the skiffs. He changed one of Han's lines of dialogue, presumably to make it seem less like he's recklessly shooting towards Lando when he can't see.
Oh wait, I thought you were blind! All right, trust me! Oh wait, I thought you were blind! It's all right, I can see a lot better.
Like with The New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, the changes to the 2004 DVD mostly were about bringing the new episodes in line with the prequels. So there were changes like Naboo being added to the End Celebration, the prequel Senate and Jedi Temple buildings being added to the shot of Coruscant, and Hayden Christensen being added as Anakin's ghost. The 2011 Blu-ray changes were mostly small effects changes, like Han's unfreezing from carbonite being enhanced, and more electronics being added to R2-D2 when he's shocked, and the Ewoks blinking in some of the shots. Some of these changes, of course, are contentious for people, and I'll be discussing all of those later. But overall, there really haven't been as many changes with this one as with the previous two, for the obvious reason that by this time Lucas was much more able to achieve what he wanted. The changes to the 4K version of Return of the Jedi are very much like the changes to A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. The opening logos are changed, of course, and then there's a lot of small differences that mostly just arise from recompositing the special effects. The shots where photography of the Rancor was composited with live action have been touched up several times, and for the 4K they were touched up again. The most notable differences from the 1983 version are that now in the shot where the Rancor is about to pick up the Gamorrean guard, his hand casts a shadow, and there's another shot where Luke has been repositioned relative to the Rancor. There are a couple actual creative changes, but they're so small you'd almost need to freeze frame the movie to see them. For one, in the shot where Vader is exiting his shuttle, most of the environment in that shot wasn't a set, it was a matte painting, and in the original version there was a small area of the painting that was blank, so that's been filled in now. Again, I think this is just the type of thing that would have slid by before, but suddenly it would stand out a lot more in 4K. Then on a shot where a speeder bike crashes into a tree, they've changed the lighting and the explosion to make the bike blend in better, but like I said, you basically need to pause the movie to even find this. There are changes though, so I'm still going to call the 4K version a distinct version. Things get interesting again with the different versions of The Phantom Menace. There's the theatrical version of The Phantom Menace, and it had one VHS release, but then for the DVD, several major changes were made, again, adding in an extra short scene on Coruscant, and a much extended second lap of the pod race, and after that the theatrical version has never been released again, so those are basically the first two versions of The Phantom Menace. In the end, the pod race after the DVD version is probably the sequence which, in its current version, is the most changed from its original version out of any scene in all 6 of Lucas's Star Wars episodes, not counting scenes that are entirely new. Lucas added material to the starting grid sequence before the race, introducing more of the racers and giving them little moments. He also added a new small scene of Shmi talking to Anakin. The new material is peppered throughout the sequence, sometimes a new moment or a small scene, or sometimes just a single new shot. He also added a lot of material to the second lap of the race, which shows more of the other racers, and better shows off Anakin's skills as a pilot. The pod race was already a long sequence in the theatrical version, so he was trying to speed it up where possible by cutting these things out, but having the extra moments makes the other racers less anonymous and gives the sequence more detail. There are actually quite a few more moments from the sequence that are in the deleted scenes on the DVD, so Lucas wasn't just throwing everything back in. He was adding moments that he felt enriched the sequence in some way, or I guess moments that he just personally really liked. In addition to adding shots, he also cut out 2 shots, which you can see here as I show the 2 versions side by side. He also moved a moment to a different place during the second lap that you'll see when it comes up. Overall, altogether, he added about 5 minutes of material to the sequence and changed the flow from moment to moment throughout.
Hey, looks like they're clearing the grid.
Is he nervous?
He's fine.
You Jedi are far too reckless. The Queen is not.
Queen trusts my judgment, young handmaiden. You should too.
You assume too much.
Start your engines.
He has to complete 2 more circuits.
Yeah.
On the DVD, the movie's color timing was pretty different to the other versions. It had a somewhat rose tint, and the picture was cropped in more closely than in the theatrical versions. On the Blu-ray, the color was changed back closer to the theatrical version, but not exactly the same, and the close cropping was undone, restoring about 8% of the image throughout the movie, and actually now showing slightly more image than was visible in the theatrical version. There were a number of other changes besides the color and reformatting, so the Blu-ray of The Phantom Menace is the movie's third version. There were a couple small changes to effects shots, like the Jedi's speedrunning effect and one of the Neimoidian's view screens, but the biggest change was Yoda being replaced throughout with the CGI version.
He was trained in the Jedi arts.
For the prequels, from the Blu-rays to the 4K, there isn't very much of a change. Most of Phantom Menace was shot on film, but nearly every shot had some kind of digital work done to it, which would have been done at around 2K or less at the time. So to create a 4K version, what they're mostly doing is upsampling 2K work, rather than redoing it from scratch. It's a similar case with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, which were both shot digitally at 1080p and had effects work done at around 2K. So creating a 4K version means upsampling footage that was captured at a lower resolution. When Phantom Menace was released in 3D in 2012, there was one small cosmetic change made to it. Presumably because in 3D, Anakin's tool in this shot would be sticking out towards the viewers, the end of the tool was redone to have more detail. The 4K release follows the 3D version, so because of this one change, I'll call the 3D version a fourth version and the latest version of the Phantom Menace. Things get really interesting in the case of Attack of the Clones, which actually had 3 versions in its original theatrical release, none of which have ever been released on home video. Attack of the Clones was the first major film shot digitally, but at the time, there were only a handful of theaters in the country that could project it that way, so most people saw a version on film. Because it took longer to make the film prints and get them into theaters, several small changes weren't made in time for this version, and were only seen by people who went to one of the theaters that was projecting the film digitally.
To be angry is to be human.
I'm a Jedi. I know I'm better than this.
Then there was also a third version of the movie for IMAX screens. Due to the technical limitations of IMAX at the time, this version had to be about half an hour shorter than the other versions, so a very different edit of the movie was made, actually the most drastic re-edit that's ever been given to any of the 6 Star Wars movies. So those are the 3 main versions of Attack of the Clones that you might have seen in its original theatrical release. There was also technically a 4th version of the movie during the original theatrical run in some foreign markets where their censorship rules required that a moment where Obi-Wan headbutts Jango Fett be removed, but that was a censorship decision and not a creative choice, so I'm not going to count it. I think it might be debatable whether the DVD release of Attack of the Clones is different than the digital version from theaters, because I don't know of a preservation that's been made of the digital theatrical version to compare the two. But I remember at the time there was talk of changes made to the digital theatrical version, and then with the DVD talk of more changes that hadn't been made to that version in the theater. Some reports mix the changes from the two versions, so I suppose it's possible that the changes people thought were new on the DVD were already there on the digital version and weren't noticed. But I don't think that's the case, so I'm calling the DVD release a 4th version.
Are you right?
Yes.
Are you all right?
Uh-huh.
Then, like all the other movies on the Blu-ray release of Attack of the Clones, of course there was another handful of tweaks, the most significant of which are probably 2 sequences in the film being re-edited and sound being added when Anakin is dreaming so you can hear what he's seeing in his dream.
Don't. No. Mom, don't. No. Mom.
And then, like I said before, the 4K situation is similar to that of The Phantom Menace, in this case with no physical negative to rescan, and the original digital photography having been done at less than 4K, the lower resolution version was just upsampled to make a 4K version. Although it wasn't given a wide release, a 3D version of Attack of the Clones was made, and according to people who have seen it, a lot of work was done to maximize the use of the format. But if there were any editorial changes or changes to the effects done for this version, they didn't make it through to the 4K version, which is essentially the same as the Blu-ray, so I won't count the 3D as a separate version. So that means for Attack of the Clones, we have a total of 5 versions. The other interesting thing about Attack of the Clones is the way that the release, with a different version for special venues and effects shots that were completed for some of the release versions but not for the others, is exactly like the situation with Empire Strikes Back 22 years prior. As much as people who are fans of the original trilogy who criticize the prequels and the special editions and like to create this fictional idea that Lucas changed so much over the years, the truth is that when you look into the productions of these movies, he's remained remarkably consistent with how he's doing it.
I haven't changed much over the years. It's funny, if you were to see all the films, you begin to see that there's a certain continuity of eccentric taste that flies through those movies.
I think the remarkable thing is actually how little he has changed, and how focused he stayed over 30 years on his original vision for these movies.
Some of the stuff comes off like little things that may have always bothered him. Like a person with a perfectly clean house, like seeing just a spot and going,
sure,
trying to get it out, like the Ewok's eyes blinking.
Yeah.
That may have bugged him.
Yeah, but but if that's true, then why didn't he do it 10 years ago? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or 5 years ago.
One example I like to use now is the Ewoks blinking in the 2011 version of Return of the Jedi. That's a nice little change, I think, that makes the masks look a little more lifelike and a little less like masks. But when I saw it in 2011, I did assume that it must have been something that had occurred to him afterward when he was rewatching the movie. But then I read the J.W. Rensler Making of Return of the Jedi book, and there's all this talk in there of how when they were making Return of the Jedi, they put a bunch of effort into trying to make the Ewok masks blink and be more animated, and it was a detail that Lucas came back to again and again. I'd also forgotten that they talk about it on the Return of the Jedi audio commentary. Kenny Baker talks about how on the set of Return of the Jedi they went to a lot of effort to try to get the Ewoks to blink.
I was the guinea pig for the eyes with Stuart Freeborn, and Stuart and I spent hours trying to work out how to get these Ewoks to blink, because George said they don't really come to life until they blink. When they blink, they come to life. So how are we going to do this? So I didn't know the first thing I had to do it, but I was the guinea pig. And Stuart, they'd got these tubes, they got these eyelids that blinked. They got a tube that went from the eyelid inside the helmet or the head piece into my neck, down the body, and round the back to a canister of gas on our back, which was round on the belt. And then we had a rubber tube inside the glove to this canister. And every time it went psst, psst, and it blinked, it made the eyes blink. Trouble is they get out and then they wouldn't return quickly enough. You couldn't put return springs. I don't know how they got it to work eventually. They were a problem.
So even a little change like the Ewoks blinking isn't revisionism. It's something that he's wanted to do since the beginning, something he's had in mind the whole time. It's kind of a recurring theme from my video on the prequels, that fans have this illusion that Lucas has changed so much, but in reality they're the ones who changed when they got older. And once you start going through the details of the productions of all of these movies, you find more and more examples showing exactly that. There's something really single-minded about the fact that for 30 years it's stuck in his mind that we need to get those Ewoks to blink. If it was something that was bothering him when he was making the original movie, it never stopped bothering him. It stayed with him until he was able to fix it. Revenge of the Sith has the least complicated history of different versions out of all of the movies, and I think the reason for that also gives insight into the changes that all the movies went through. Contrary to the notion of Lucas endlessly, restlessly changing his mind, after Revenge of the Sith was released, it was pretty much finished. On the Blu-ray, there are a couple of very minor changes to the sound mix, which, again, I think are just the kind of inevitable changes that are going to happen when you're converting work to a different format, and you're doing a new sound mix, so you're making new decisions. There was also a wipe that was there in the theatrical version, and then it wasn't there in the DVD, but I'm pretty sure that change was just an error because then it was back again on the Blu-ray. Aside from those tiny little things, there's been a grand total of one change to Revenge of the Sith since the theatrical version. This one building on Kashyyyk on the Blu-ray had some moss and detail added to the roof. This change is exactly the kind of thing that people criticizing the special editions will say is stupid or pointless, or point to as evidence that Lucas is just a crazy person who can't stop obsessively tinkering with the movies. But I think the reason for this is really pretty obvious. Lucas would have been planning the 3D releases and probably the new 4K transfers in 2011 when the Blu-rays came out, and a lot of people speculated that a lot of the changes were the types of things that would add detail and make these things look better in 3D and in higher resolutions. Before adding the moss, the Kashyyyk roofs in these shots were plain and probably would have looked very smooth and plastic in 3D and in 4K, so he added a little texture to them. It's hardly something that's insane or inscrutable or nefarious. I guess this one thing is technically a change though, so due to that one change, I'll say that we have two versions of Revenge of the Sith. So now that we've got all of that out of the way, given all these versions and the fact that there are at least 9 different versions of A New Hope alone, when people say that they want both versions, what two versions exactly are they talking about? And why are those two versions more important than the other 7? Specifically, what they usually mean is the theatrical release edit, only not the limited release version. They want the improved special effects shots from the wide release version. And with the third permutation, I think, of the soundtrack that combines elements from the original stereo and mono versions. So, not really the original version, basically a reconstructed version based on what they remember from home video in their childhoods. If you let the fans try to explain to you what they want, it always comes out confused if you try to talk about it in any detail. A guy named Alexandre Philippe made a documentary called The People versus George Lucas that attempted to document what Star Wars fans want from George Lucas. In the end, People versus George Lucas is an astounding document of fanboy entitlement and ignorance. I mean, honestly, these people are kind of fucking embarrassing. I recommend it for the window that it unintentionally offers into how dysfunctional and immature fan quote-unquote culture has gotten. But if you consider yourself a fan of Star Wars, I'll warn you before you watch it, you will never be more embarrassed of being a Star Wars fan than when you watch this movie and listen to these people refer to themselves as the same thing.
What's up? Hey, it's Alexandre Philippe, the director of People versus George Lucas. So what was your motivation or inspiration for wanting to make this film?
Well, I grew up very much as a Star Wars fan,
A lot of people think the film is kind of like a George Lucas bashing movie because it's called The People versus George Lucas.
Sure. It's just not, it's obviously not that. It was really our intent to make a very, very balanced, very objective debate around the issue.
Alexander's a huge Star Wars fan. He's a collector. He wanted to create a film that he could sit on a couch next to George Lucas and watch it with him and feel proud of what he put out there.
But also a lot of love and affection and admiration towards George.
It was stupid.
It was.
You can't do that. You can't do that.
Han Solo fired first!
Yeah, that was ridiculous.
My motivation for redoing The Phantom Menace, quite frankly, was because I thought the movie was absolute ass. In my fan edit, you won't find mentions of midichlorians. That's not part of my Star Wars.
Serious? Are you serious?
But it's a dick thing to do.
He's almost like a Holocaust denier, but he's a Star Wars denier. It's like
that. Then I just want to say fuck him all the way. Yeah.
What are you trying to do? Are you actually trying to antagonize us?
We want the authors of our texts to be dead and for us to have complete control over them.
I think we will have to pry Star Wars out of George Lucas's cold, dead hand.
So fucking bad, but it just gets worse and fucking worse.
George, you must own up to your mistake.
George, you need to take a long fucking walk off a short fucking pier at the moment because your movies are the worst piece of shit I have ever seen.
And I saw some guys selling a t-shirt that actually did say George Lucas raped my childhood.
Isn't there a song, George Raped My Childhood?
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped.
I think he took something wonderful and in an effort to maintain control over it while at the same time capitalizing on it, I think he broke it.
Yeah, he's like an overprotective parent, and by doing that he's retarded his child. And that's annoying.
This is a crucial scene, George, and you fucked it up.
How are you going to unfuck this?
Even if he only released that in the 70-disc box set where you have to buy all 70 discs, like every version with the Clone Wars, fine, I'll buy it, sell the rest of that garbage on eBay, and keep the 3 fucking discs that I want.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
I think there is something insulting, and I'm going to side with the fans for a second. I think there's something insulting for somebody to step up and tell millions of people, this thing that you love so much is no good at all. And I want to change it.
I agree.
Right?
So in a very, very diplomatic way, you're saying George Lucas is a giant asshole.
So apparently that's what love looks like to a certain kind of Star Wars fan. Try to keep your panties dry, ladies.
Which I love Boba Fett.
There's no limit to how freakish people can get.
Most of the fans in the People versus George Lucas, and most of the fans who want the theatrical first versions of the original trilogy, seem to think releasing an earlier version of the movies isn't much more difficult than just scanning the movie, maybe color correcting it, and slapping it onto a disc. But of course it wouldn't be that simple at all. You don't just take a 40-year-old film print and slap it on a 4K disc and expect it to look brand new. The fans would obviously be unhappy with anything less than a meticulous restoration, which is a massive amount of work and expense.
This comes from the PR department at Lucasfilm. We hope that releasing those original movies on a bonus disc, original is in quotes, by the way, as if they're not really the originals. It's just something we made up. The negatives of the movies were permanently altered for the creation of the special editions, and existing prints of the first versions are in poor condition. We want you to be aware that we have no plans, now or in the future, to restore the earlier versions.
Nobody actually physically cuts a negative. An archival, you dupe the negative, and then you make the changes from that. So I find it very hard to believe they've actually physically destroyed the negative of the film. And if they did, I mean, that is just, heinous.
That's what Lucasfilm is claiming, but it's probably not true.
Fans a few years back went nuts when Lucasfilm said that the original versions didn't exist anymore, and the fans called Lucas a liar. But what Lucasfilm was referring to was the fact that when they made the 1997 version, they cut and re-edited the original negative and recomposited the original physical film elements. So the original theatrical version still exists out there in the form of 35mm and 70mm prints. I'm sure some very nice ones, but the original camera negative now exists in the 1997 configuration, so you can't create prints of the original version from the original negative anymore. It's gone, exactly as Lucasfilm said. To release things now in optimal 4K versions, where possible, they go back and scan the original negative. Even a pristine theatrical print is another generation from the negative and would lose quality and detail. When the movies were seen in theaters decades ago, those prints would travel around for months or even years, and they'd acquire damage every single time they were screened. So what people were seeing then wasn't similar to what people expect now from a high-end HD home video release. In reality, the level of detail you might have seen in A New Hope in its original theatrical release might have been something closer to 720p than 4K. With some movies where the original negatives have been lost, all we have to make copies from are the theatrical prints, and if you have a well-preserved one, you can make it look pretty good. But that's certainly not what Star Wars fans have in mind when they're demanding a new 4K version of the original trilogy. If it was, they could be happy with just scanning and restoring old film prints of the movies themselves, which they've done, but it hasn't stopped them from still demanding a newly remastered version. In the case of a movie like Star Wars with such heavy special effects, even the master interpositive from which prints were made wouldn't actually be optimal for a 4K remastering of the movie. In every shot originally where special effects were created by compositing original elements to make it look like things filmed separately were in a shot together, those elements were combined and reprinted in an optical printer, making the final shot another generation further away from what was originally filmed, and again reducing quality and introducing the possibility of errors or imperfections with every step of this process.
There are 365 special photographic effects in Star Wars, more than in any other movie. For this scene, each effect element was shot separately, then added to the live action. Even the laser beam of Luke's sword was optically printed into the scene. Other elements like the chess set and rays were added in the same way.
So we brought in a team of film restorationists to start a full-scale film restoration. The first step was to take the original negative apart and physically rewash the entire negative. From that point, we realized that The opticals, which we couldn't rewash because the dirt was built into the elements, also had to be recomposited.
Creating composites for the original release of the trilogy required film technicians to physically handle the negative. This led to wear and tear as well as dirt deposits on the final picture. Today, compositing takes place with computers, but before this technology could be applied to Star Wars, all the original elements had to be located. Some scenes had as many as 40 elements for a single shot, as was the case for the asteroid sequence in Empire. Typically, these elements are discarded after the film is completed.
In the case of Star Wars and Empire and Jedi, all those pieces exist. That was due to the fact that George kept everything. So that gives you the ability to do this.
In addition to making what you see another generation away from the original photography, it's also how you get imperfections like garbage mats and matte lines around objects, all of which would be magnified in an HD version. So that's why when they made the 4K versions of the original trilogy, in many cases they went back and rescanned the original individual elements of the shots and recomposited them digitally. This isn't a simple thing to do though, in a case like the Star Wars movies where some of the original shots that they're recreating are incredibly complicated.
This was taking the process of these kinds of space battles to like the furthest degree I think anybody's ever been able to take them. I mean, using this kind of technology, which is analog technology. The way these are done is they're sort of run through a printer over and over and over and over again. The more ships, the more times you have to run through. Some of the shots in this sequence took 24 hours just to run through the printer. So then you'd look at it, and if there was anything wrong, one mistake made on one frame, you had to go back and redo it again. And every time you did it, there was a chance that somebody, somewhere along the line, you'd make a mistake because you were trying to make sure that all of the sequences were put in the printer exactly the same way, and the same frame had to line up with the same frame. You had to do this, for all the mats and all of the shots and all of the, objects that are in the frame. And it got to be very, very difficult.
As the shows went on, we got better at shooting blue screen faster so we could set the models up, but the techniques were all pretty much the same all the way through the shows. What we got better at was programming. We could program models faster, so we have these shots where there's hundreds of ships going by, where there's one shot where he's got, I think he said 120 separate motion-controlled spaceships in it. It was so big what George wanted. But, it came from our skill getting better and faster at being able to do the work. There wasn't really a big breakthrough in the technology during these shows, that I could really see.
According to an article from 1977, including the lasers and matte paintings and models and so on, A New Hope alone had over 10,000 individual film elements that had to be separately photographed and composited into the movie, and A New Hope was by far the least complicated of the original trilogy in terms of effects. By the time that they got to Return of the Jedi, they were dealing with as many as 120 separate spaceships in a single shot and up to 20 layers of photography. And it wouldn't just be elaborate space battle shots that they'd have to redo. This kind of reconstruction is necessary even for something as simple as a wipe between two shots. In the master interpositive of the film from which copies are created, the film with the wipe in it would be a print of the two original shots combined, or in other words, a generation further from the original negative than a shot that hadn't been altered would be. For the shot to look as pristine as the rest of the film, you would have to find the original negative of each shot that was combined by the wipe from before they were combined and recreate the transition between them.
If you look at the shot as it existed in the original Star Wars, it's kind of buffered by two transition points. I think what happens is you have a clockwise wipe that goes from a sandcrawler shot into the Tatooine Dunes shot. And then you have an iris out shot back to another miniature photography shot. So right away, we realized that we weren't dealing necessarily with live action. What we were dealing with was an element that was at one time or another brought down to an optical house, recomped to add the transition. So what was in the movie was not the original footage.
Here we are in the Lucasfilm archives, which houses all the material shot for every Lucasfilm production, beginning with THX 1138. This is where the search for the trooper in the desert sequence began, starting with the Star Wars work print material, which Tom Christopher, the editor, had already removed into his cutting room. There he was able to identify which elements he thought would be useful in remaking the effect, and it was my job after that to start a search for the negative. To look for the negative, I had to come here to our cold storage vault, which houses all the negative for Willow, indie movies, Empire, and finally we get to the Star Wars area, which is where I had to go digging for the Trooper in the Desert negative. So what happened is we went through all these boxes. We were not able to find the one that was actually used to make the effect.
Just before it was scanned, we found the O-neg, the original neg that went into the shot.
All this material was discovered at ILM, and this had been sitting unbeknownst to anybody on top of their cold storage vault, and it was just by luck somebody found it, and inside, sure enough, was the select slate.
Tom Christopher's group up there was able to locate all the original negative because George had fortunately kept all the pieces. And so we had to additionally rewash every piece of negative that way too, so we could recomp these. So that immediately took all the dirt problems that were built into the opticals out. Fortunately, because of the way the negative was cut, we were able to dissect the film. We double scrubbed and double rewashed these negatives.
The first step was to take the original negative apart and physically rewash the entire negative.
Nobody actually physically cuts a negative.
When Lucas says that the original version doesn't exist anymore, he means that the original camera negative has been edited to incorporate the later changes, but he's not saying that they threw away everything that they trimmed. Everybody knows that all the original elements have been preserved and are saved.
I started out as an editor, so to me, saving the film is what the whole process is about. And so I've saved all my films, I've saved all the negative, I've saved everything. Partly because I'm a pack rat, and partly because as an editor, I just don't want to throw those things out because I never know when I might want to go back into it again.
So with Star Wars, yeah, they could find the elements of the original versions of the shots and reconstruct them as they originally were, but it would be a process of rebuilding the movie and recombining hundreds of elements, and altogether would be a huge, complicated process, probably requiring years of labor and research, and in the end, most likely costing more than the entire original budget of the first Star Wars film. And all of that work for what? To please a vocal minority of aging fans that call Lucas a rapist and advocate for him to not be allowed to control his own work? Which brings us back again to the question of what the fans really want. You could say that a lot of those shots that would need to be recomposited, the ones that haven't been substantially changed in the different editions, were already recomposited for the 4K version that we have. But if they were recomposited, are they really the original shots? When people say that they want the original, just how original do they actually mean?
The snow battle was a challenge when we did it because nobody had ever done blue screen matting on a white surface. Usually do it on dark surfaces.
We used optical technology, of course, to do all that compositing. And a telltale sign that something's been optically composited is a black line around it. And when you have a sequence that takes place in outer space against stars, it's easy to reach a point where those black lines don't show up. But when you have a sequence that takes place against snow in the daylight, every hint of that black matte line becomes very visible. And so the first time through doing the snow battle here 17 years ago, a lot of effort went into finding ways to minimize that black line. One of the ways was to not print all of the elements at their full opacity. Consequently, when you see the snow battle on film, you may notice that there's part of the scenery is visible through the cockpit. And it was a constant trade-off of how transparent can we make the cockpit? At what point is the black line more objectionable than the transparency?
So going back and looking at it, we realized that we really needed to remap the entire sequence, which is over 100 shots.
And so there was an opportunity to go back into those shots, use the computer technology, and eliminate all the transparency, but also not have any matte lines.
In the case of something like the transparent cockpits on the snowspeeders in Empire Strikes Back, fans would want the shots recomposited digitally, or they would complain about the poor picture quality. But if they're going to recomposite it, should they leave in the transparency that was originally there when it was composited optically before they could do this digitally? Even though with digital compositing, there's no reason that the transparency needs to be there. But then if they remove the transparency, isn't that technically a special edition improvement? So just how original do people mean when they say original? Would they want something like that fixed or not? What about something like the change to R2-D2 when he's in space? Originally, these shots were done with R2's panels being black instead of blue, since blue would have created problems with the blue screen behind him. There's no reason that that can't be fixed now, though. Is that any different than tweaking the color timing or improving some other kind of special effect? And in fact, I think if they didn't change things like this, like if his panels were still black in these scenes, it would be very noticeable in HD and people would probably think it was a mistake. So should that be changed? What about all the other many examples of matte lines or wonky lightsabers, all of which would be magnified by an HD presentation. In almost all of these cases, I think that not only would fans want the problem to be fixed, they'd be upset if it wasn't fixed. I think in a lot of cases, fans asking for the original versions have kind of forgotten what the original versions really looked like. I recently watched a fan scan of a 1977 print of A New Hope, and it's really interesting. I mean, for one thing, the film is grainy as fuck, matte lines and mistakes everywhere. It's exciting in its way, though, because it's very bold how they were obviously pushing the limit of what they could do, and it's amazing that it holds together at all. It's exciting to see them make something out of scotch tape and popsicle sticks with hardly any money, and it's amazing that it works. Personally, I like how the movie looks with all those flaws, but I like old movies. I like the effects in silent movies. Aside from the effects, I think that the film grain alone in an authentic version of the original version of Star Wars would probably strike most viewers now as a mistake, because they're so used to everything being so scrubbed, they don't remember what film used to look like. They think that a good restoration means that it looks like it was shot today, and that you can see every pore on the actor's skin and every fiber in his clothes, when in fact it wouldn't have looked anything like that when you saw it originally. If they bought a version of A New Hope that was actually accurate to its original presentation, expecting to use it to show off their new 4K TV, they would think it was the worst thing ever. They would be pissed off, and they would see the fact that there weren't any changes as meaning that it hadn't been what they would consider restored. In other words, they do want special edition changes. They just want the changes that they like. Or in other words, again, they think that they should be the one deciding which one of these changes should be made. They think that the fans should be the ones editing these films, and that's a major problem.
He went from, being one filmmaker who just did it his way, he was a maverick, to now all of a sudden, rethinking everything and second-guessing himself.
I think fans misunderstand their own emotion because they think that they're mad that Lucas sold out and went from being a maverick that did it his way, when what they're actually really mad about is that he never stopped doing it his way, and they think that eventually he was supposed to start taking notes from the fans and doing as he was told.
I think it's okay for George to keep changing the movie every time, as long as he preserves, those films that affected us so much in the front. Yeah, it's not too much to ask. I mean, it really isn't. I mean, every classic film, I think, deserves that much.
Yeah.
And the one classic film that we don't have is Star Wars. I mean, makes no sense.
But now it's gotten to the point where George Lucas kind of seems like an obsessive compulsive disorder crazy person.
Yeah.
Where nothing can be, it can't ever be perfect, can't ever be
you have
perfect.
To keep fixing.
The popular idea is that what Lucas has done with Star Wars and the later versions of the movie is somehow strange and outrageous, but the truth is that this is one of those things that a certain kind of Star Wars fan thinks because they don't know anything about any movies besides Star Wars.
Now these are eyes that analyze movies.
The reality is, if you go through art history, what Lucas has done with his movies couldn't be more normal. This idea that Star Wars fans have invented that the version that they saw when the movies were originally theatrically issued is sacrosanct and should never be touched is really a kind of strange fiction that requires an ignorance of film history and really of the history of all kinds of art. The thing is that compared to other artists that have altered their work after it was initially released, the changes Lucas has made to Star Wars really are pretty small and trivial. For an early example to show that this has been going on as long as there have been movies, when Charlie Chaplin reissued his silent movies after the introduction of synchronized sound, he wrote musical scores for several of them. This is very similar to what Lucas is doing with the special editions, taking advantage of new technology that didn't exist when his movies were originally made to update them for a new audience. But Chaplin didn't just add music. In the cases of several movies, he drastically re-edited them. With The Kid, he cut out entire subplots, rearranged several sequences, and ultimately cut the film all the way from 68 minutes down to 53. When he reissued The Gold Rush with music, he also added spoken narration, tightened the editing throughout, eliminated some subplots, and removed a kiss at the end, ultimately bringing the movie all the way down from 95 minutes to 72 minutes. The shorter length was also helped by the films being played at 24 frames per second to accommodate how movies were being played with sound, as opposed to the slower frame rate at which the movie would have originally been projected. So actually everything you saw throughout the entire film, even the scenes that hadn't been newly edited, was slightly different than it would have been originally. Chaplin's just one example. After Kubrick released The Shining, he changed his mind about the end of the movie and cut a 2-minute scene that showed Danny and Wendy after they had escaped the Overlook. When the film was released in Europe, he made another version of the film and removed a further 25 minutes. For the home video release, Kubrick decided to show the film in an open matte ratio of 1.33 to 1, which is again different from the theatrical aspect ratio people would have seen it in. This is closer to the ratio it was shot in, so people watching it this way were seeing more of the image than was originally seen in theaters, as opposed to a pan and scan movie where the original image is cropped on the side. There were also some edits to the film for TV versions and differences to the end credits in early releases, but not counting those smaller changes, depending on where and when you've seen it over the years, you might have seen a version of The Shining that was either 146, 144, or 119 minutes long, or even some other length, and also versions that had a drastically different aspect ratio. The Shining isn't the only time that Kubrick changed his movies like this. When 2001: A Space Odyssey was originally released, it was 161 minutes long, but Kubrick decided to edit out 19 minutes, making a version that was 142 minutes, sometimes with an intermission. Most home video versions now include the overture, intermission, and exit music, so you've probably seen a version that's 149 minutes long. The interesting comparison here to Star Wars is how Star Wars fans act like some of the tiniest changes you can imagine. Some changes that you literally have to pause the movie to see because they're only a couple of frames. Star Wars fans act like these changes are blasphemy and that they shouldn't be allowed. They act like these changes are examples of Lucas being mentally ill and obsessive compulsive. Can you imagine how a Star Wars fan would react if Lucas did what Kubrick did and he decided that A New Hope was a little bit long and so he cut out an entire 19 minutes of the movie? And yet, as outrageous as it would sound to a Star Wars fan, those types of changes aren't that uncommon in film history. I mean, if you want to talk about filmmakers being obsessive about detail or controlling about how their work is presented, go read a little bit more about Kubrick sometime. He sent exhibitors this note that he personally wrote detailing his demands about exactly how projectionists should show Barry Lyndon. He sent out his assistants to photograph the displays of his movies in home video stores so he could respond if he didn't like how the store clerks were shelving his movies. And yet Star Wars fans think that it's obsessive compulsive and too controlling when Lucas just has the ballsy idea that he should be the one deciding on the final cut of his movies. Those types of Star Wars fans just aren't used to watching movies where it's the artist who's making all the shots, as opposed to some corporation who sees the director as a hired hand like Disney does. Kubrick really isn't the most extreme example of a director changing his movies after release either. There was a lot of talk recently about Francis Ford Coppola making a new version of The Godfather 3, but it's far from the only time that he's done something like that. In 1977, he edited the first two Godfather movies together into one film known as The Godfather Saga, rearranging the two movies to show the scenes in chronological order and also adding about 75 minutes of additional footage. The Godfather Saga version, which was already a new iteration of other movies, in itself has two versions. Originally, the violence was toned down for TV, and then in a later version, it was reinstated. There was another version of the same idea, combining the two movies in 1981, which was called The Godfather 1902 through 1951, The Complete Epic, which in spite of the complete in its title, was 386 minutes, while The Godfather Saga version was 434. Then when they showed this version on HBO, they restored some but not all of the footage from the Saga version, making it 423 minutes that time. There was yet another version called The Godfather Trilogy 1901 through 1980, which edited all three movies together in chronological order, also incorporating scenes not shown in the theatrical versions, bringing that version to a total of 583 minutes. If you're counting, that's 5 different versions of the first two Godfather movies edited together, not including the original two movies themselves. When Coppola did his most recent new version of Godfather 3, he gave it a new beginning and a new ending. He rearranged a lot of it, and ultimately he made the movie shorter and even changed the title. But that's actually the 4th version he's made of Godfather 3, because there was also a TV broadcast version that added a couple scenes to the theatrical version, and then the home video version that was originally called a Final Director's Cut added 9 minutes to the movie. The version that was called the Final Director's Cut supplanted the theatrical version and was the only version you would see on home video for decades until they recently released this new version. I'm leaving out a few TV versions and things that had slight differences, but if you're still counting at home, that makes a total of 12 different versions of the 3 Godfather movies. Aside from the changes that he's made to the Godfather movies, Coppola has also made about 4 different versions of The Outsiders. There's a version referred to as the complete novel with an extra 22 minutes. There's a TV version with some extra scenes. There's a version that was then called the uncut version that's actually around 10 minutes longer than the version with complete in the title. Of course, he's done 3 versions of Apocalypse Now, the theatrical version at 147 minutes, the one known as Apocalypse Now Redux, which is 197 minutes, and then Apocalypse Now the Final Cut, which is 183 minutes. But wait, there's more. A few years ago, he also released a new version of The Cotton Club, this time retitled The Cotton Club Encore, which runs 139 minutes as opposed to the original 129, and it's also been edited and changed throughout. He also did a director's cut of Dementia 13, which is re-edited throughout, and ultimately became 6 minutes shorter than the original version. I'll point out here again that while Lucas is making small tweaks to visual effects and things and adding a shot here or there, there, directors like Kubrick and Coppola are cutting out whole sections of their movies or adding back in as much as 75 minutes to the movies, which is almost a whole additional movie. Yet, somehow, Lucas is the one who gets treated as the great vandal of film history. I could keep going and name other directors that tinker as much as Coppola, too. While I was working on this, a friend of mine mentioned Michael Mann to me, and it would take a whole other video just to list all the changes that Michael Mann has made to his movies. Actually, I could probably do a whole video just about different versions of Manhunter. I would be hard-pressed to even come up with the number of versions of Manhunter that exist, because it seems like virtually every time it's ever been released, there are changes. There have been several releases of Manhunter that are labeled as containing both a theatrical version and a director's cut version, but the director's cut has been significantly different each time. Not only that, the version in these sets labeled as the theatrical version has also been different each time too. Then there are anomalies like the entirely re-edited and retitled version of the movie that was done for TV, which was a version where they gave the movie the name of the book again, Red Dragon, to try to tie it into the release of Silence of the Lambs. And Manhunter is just one example. Stuff like this goes on with nearly every Michael Mann film. The Keep is supposed to have a 210-minute director's cut as opposed to the 96-minute version that was released, and while the complete version has never been released, various scenes from it have found their way into different edits of the movie for TV, and it's another one where it's hard to figure out how many versions there actually even are, since there are so many variations that you might possibly see. Last of the Mohicans has been released in 112, 117, and 114-minute versions, two of which were both marketed as director's cuts. He recut Heat slightly for the 2009 Blu-ray. Miami Vice has a director's cut that's 7 minutes longer than the theatrical version. Black Hat has a European version of the film that's slightly shorter, and it also has a director's cut that's 3 minutes longer than the theatrical version and extensively re-edited. I could keep going, but I think I've made my point that it's asinine to suggest that Lucas's tinkering on Star Wars is in some ways strange or unique.
Think Blade Runner exists in 5 different versions. Brazil exists in 3 different versions. Terry Gilliam embraces those various versions. When Criterion put out their box set, it includes every version, including the one that he hated and had nothing to do with.
When people argue that the theatrical versions of Star Wars should coexist alongside the new versions, they're fond of pointing out a few exceptional cases like Blade Runner, where the home video release includes several versions. But obviously this is much more about making money than it is about some artistic reason or moral obligation. There are very few movies that have a fan base that will buy 5 versions of the same movie again and again, and if it's up to the studio, of course they'll soak them for the extra money. This isn't the default though. Ridley Scott doesn't own Blade Runner, and if it was up to him, a few of those 5 versions that are released every time wouldn't have ever even been made, much less released alongside his version. You'll notice obviously when you buy 2001 on home video, it doesn't contain alternate versions of the film, nor is it labeled as a special edition. It's just the movie, it's just 2001 presented in the director's preferred version, as it should be. You don't get 3 versions of The Shining when you buy it on home video. In contrast with how Lucas always has let the fans openly trade the versions of his movies that he doesn't like, Kubrick actually burned the scenes that he removed from his films precisely because he said he didn't want anybody after he was gone to have the ability to assemble his art in a form that was contrary to his wishes. If you had told Kubrick he somehow owed it to the fans to give us every version of The Shining or to give us our own choice of whether or not we wanted Dr. Strangelove to have the pie fight scene included, he would have rightly told you to go get fucked. That's because Kubrick was making a serious piece of art, not a fucking choose-your-own-adventure novel. The editorial choices of a movie aren't meant to be made by an audience vote. It's also either very disingenuous or ignorant to point out that the Criterion Collection release of Terry Gilliam's Brazil includes 3 versions of the movie, including the one the director hated, as though this is evidence that they accept that you should always present every version of a movie. People saying this don't mention that the point of including the version of Brazil that Gilliam hates was that Gilliam wanted to show how awful the version the studio wanted to make was and make fun of it. And notably, the version that he doesn't like is included in the set, but it's copied from the film as it exists, unfinished and unrestored and in the wrong aspect ratio. In other words, he didn't go to the time and expense of restoring a version he didn't like, which is exactly what Star Wars fans are demanding from Lucas. The Criterion Collection will sometimes include alternate versions of movies, but they, and all distributors that care about film as an art form, will seek out the approval of the director, and whenever possible, they will proudly note that the version you're getting is the director-approved edit, or a director-approved transfer or restoration. The goal should always be to present it as the director intended. Star Wars is unique, not in the fact that Lucas has changed it, but in the fact that it's one of very few cases where the fans feel entitled to demand a version that is specifically not director approved. In the case of Tree of Life, for example, Criterion released an extremely different edit that Terrence Malick made that was 50 minutes longer than the theatrical version. Their release did not include both versions. Until the End of the World is another example, the original release being a heavily edited 158-minute version that Wim Wenders has called the Reader's Digest version, and then after that there was a 178-minute version and a 300-minute version that had limited releases, but with the Criterion edition of the movie, they released a 287-minute version that wasn't the most complete version or the original version, but rather the director's preferred version. Very often, Criterion will release alternate versions of the films that the directors have made, and they will not include the theatrical version in their release, which makes it even more silly for Star Wars fans to cite the release of Brazil as though that's the norm.
And the one classic film that we don't have is Star Wars.
And the other thing here is that an artist wanting to revisit his own work is hardly a strange or unusual impulse. Hitchcock made The Man Who Knew Too Much twice, first in 1934, and then he made the entire movie again in 1956. Michael Haneke made Funny Games in 1997 in German, and then he made the whole entire movie again in English in 2007. Woody Allen was famous for rewriting and reshooting huge chunks of his movies, the most extreme example being when he wasn't happy with September, he refilmed the entire movie again with a mostly new cast. Now, obviously, if you buy September on home video, you don't get the version that Woody Allen rejected, and you don't get the choice of which scenes you want from which version. If you buy Outsiders, you don't get all 4 versions. There's no release which includes all 4 versions of Godfather 3. Actually, I personally really like the Godfather Saga version of the first 2 movies, and there are scenes in there that aren't in any of the other versions, a lot of scenes that aren't in the other versions. That hasn't been re-released in HD. There have been releases and reconstructions of the earlier versions of the movies that Chaplin changed, but the portions that he deleted are in much worse quality than the scenes from the versions he preferred. The reason for that is, with Chaplin, since he owned a lot of his own work, a lot of it has been preserved in much higher quality than other movies from the same era, but he didn't pay equal attention to preserving the versions that he didn't prefer. I think I've made my point now that directors revisiting and changing their movies is extremely common, in spite of Star Wars fans somehow getting the idea that the situation with Star Wars is unique. But as common as this is in movies, because of the fact that movies are so expensive and directors rarely own their own work, it's actually much, much more common in other art forms. In serialized comics, for example, which often have a rushed schedule, changes to the version that's first serialized are frequently made in the collected editions. Grant Morrison's Bat Saga was a 7-year project, but in the home stretch, DC decided to relaunch their line with the New 52, which meant that keeping consistency with the new continuity would contradict elements of the story that were set in the past. In the collected Absolute Edition, these instances were redrawn to maintain consistency within Morrison's story, but that was only the beginning of the changes that they made. When it was originally being published due to deadline issues, a number of pages in the issues that were primarily drawn by Chris Burnham were drawn by fill-in artists Jason Masters and others. So for the collected edition, as long as they were already redrawing things, Chris Burnham went back and redrew 21 of those pages to complete his issues. Then while he was working on that, Burnham further went back and started fixing still other things, details and continuity issues in the pages that he had originally drawn himself. They ended up also replacing pages that had been done by fill-in artists in other issues, recoloring some pages, and so on and on. In the end, what happened is the entire book got a facelift. And I would point out, when they print it now, they print the pages in the versions that the artists prefer and that tell the story as they intended. You don't get every version of the pages and you don't choose your own adventure. So what about in newspaper comics? Do changes like this happen there too? Why, yes, they do. If you buy the collection, The Complete Calvin and Hobbes, there are actually a total of 6 strips that have different versions which were previously published that aren't included. There's a famous missing strip from November 28th, 1985 that has never been reprinted. It originally went out to some newspapers but was replaced in others with an alternate strip. Presumably the reason for this is that in the original strip, Calvin was excited to jump into a washing machine, and Watterson or somebody at the syndicate was concerned that children might imitate. The strips for January 7th, 1987 and November 25th, 1988 both originally had jokes that could be interpreted as putting adoption in a negative light, and Watterson said that readers expressed concern to him over this. Both of those strips were rewritten in The Complete Calvin and Hobbes to remove the references to adoption. There's also the strip from November 24th, 1987, which also has altered dialogue, this time to correct a scientific inaccuracy. There are also another 2 strips that since they were large single panels, wouldn't fit into the vertical format of some Calvin and Hobbes collections, so Watterson redrew them, and 2 alternate versions of each of these strips exist and have been published. For the complete collection, though, he includes only the horizontal versions. Again, in the cases of all of these strips, you're getting the artist's preferred version, not a video game menu where you decide for yourself which version you prefer. This kind of thing happens in TV too, of course. In The Sopranos season 3 finale, they introduced Agent Deborah Cicerone, who went on to become a major character later. When the episode originally aired, she was played by Fairuza Balk, but they recast the character for the next season, and then they went back to the season 3 scenes and replaced Balk with the actor that would play the character in the later episodes, who was named Lola Glaudini. This obviously brings to mind bringing in Ian McDiarmid to redo the Emperor scenes in Empire Strikes Back. And you know what I'm going to point to next. If you buy The Sopranos on home video, you get the reshot versions of the scenes. You don't get both with an option to edit the episode to your own tastes. They did the same kind of thing on Seinfeld. Larry David was originally the voice of Newman, but when they cast Wayne Knight in the part, they had him go back and replace the lines so that when you see the episodes now, it's his voice. They did something similar when Jerry Stiller was cast as Frank Costanza, and they had him reshoot earlier scenes where the character had originally been played by a different actor. Painters go back and change their paintings all the time. X-rays have revealed that Picasso would frequently change his paintings, doing up to 13 distinct layers in some of them. Degas would sometimes paint over entire canvases with new paintings. Of course, this happens even more in plays and musicals and songs. Popular music and songs were an element of interpretation as part of every new live performance of a piece. But I'm not just talking about covers of songs or different ways in which a play could be directed. I'm talking about the original writers changing the official text of a play or the lyrics of a song. Bob Dylan has performed Tangled Up in Blue 1,685 times live, and he's almost never sung it exactly the same way twice. There are people that spend years studying and analyzing all the different changes he's made to his lyrics. Sondheim and other writers of plays and musicals frequently change the official lyrics and dialogue after the show has already played to audiences. And as common as those types of changes are in all those other mediums, they're even more common still in poetry and prose because it's a lot more common there for the artist to own control of his own work and because the changes are easier to make. The first edition of Ulysses, for example, had over 2,000 errors or things that would later be changed by James Joyce in subsequent versions. For the second edition alone, Joyce would create a 7-page errata that contained 201 corrections, and he would continue to proof and request changes to various other editions and to his own manuscripts until his death, eventually resulting in at least 18 distinct versions of the book. Because of the number of different manuscripts and rounds of changes, it's still being debated to this day which is the most correct, but the goal should always be to follow Joyce's intentions as closely as possible. The version of Frankenstein you likely read if you read the book now is a version that Mary Shelley drastically rewrote in 1831 from the originally published 1818 version. The changes she made range from expanding sections and splitting single chapters into 2 chapters, or to changing the origin of Elizabeth to being an orphan from being Victor's cousin, to many more exhaustive rewrites, subtractions, and additions. I think a lot of people know that there are 2 versions of Stephen King's The Stand. The original version was heavily abridged, and then there was a longer version released that was billed as the uncut version. The changes are actually a lot more complicated, though, than just going back and restoring the original text. Between the hardback and paperback edition of the abridged version, King was already making changes. For the paperback, he updated the date where the story took place from 1980 to 1985, and he changed details in the book accordingly. Presumably this is because he felt that an apocalyptic story would lose some impact if it took place in the past, and readers already knew that an apocalypse hadn't happened then. Apocalyptic stories are usually set in the future, but King wanted The Stand to have an immediacy and exist in the present. So it makes sense that when he later released the longer version of the book, he updated the period of the story again, this time from the 1980s to the 1990s, and again he changed many details in the story to fit the change. But you can't just stick in new pop culture details into a story about a different era and have it make sense, so while he was changing those things, he didn't stop there, and it actually became a complete rewrite of the book that changed the story in tone and style and sensibility. If you've read The Hobbit after 1951, unless you're reading an antique copy, you're reading a special edition of The Hobbit that was heavily re-edited by Tolkien after the original 1937 version had already been available for many years. The changes he made include a complete rewrite of the chapter Riddles in the Dark to change Gollum's character to fit with what would later be revealed about the Ring, which Tolkien hadn't decided on yet when he originally wrote the book, but there were a lot of other changes besides. Then in 1966, there was another version version where Tolkien made another round of changes, large and small, again mostly to bring the story in line with The Lord of the Rings and the rest of his evolving mythology. Now, of course, nobody thinks to say that every copy of The Hobbit should be packaged with a copy of all three versions, because it's Tolkien's book and the text that's presented should be his preferred version. There's not the book that Tolkien wrote and then another version with the changes demanded by fans. The book is the book. There's one book. With the Harry Potter books, there have been well over 200 changes that the publishers have acknowledged or that fans have found. These range from correcting simple errors to changing things like the dates that certain events happen to fix issues with the timeline, to all new dialogue, to detailed rewriting of certain passages to make the dialogue attribution more clear. One major example is a rewrite of details in the scene in Goblet of Fire, where the spell Priori Incantatem makes echoes of Voldemort's previous spells come out of his wand in reverse order. Originally, Harry Potter's mother and father appeared in the wrong order compared to how their murder by Voldemort was previously described, and this led to speculation that it was a hint that there was something about the deaths that we didn't know yet. It turned out that it was actually just a mistake, and events in the scene were rearranged later to fix it. This kind of thing is especially common in ongoing fantasy series where the series isn't finished yet when the first volume is published. Naturally, an author's conception of the books changes as he writes them, and by the end you've traveled a long distance from the beginning, so it's common and it makes sense to want to go back and revise things in the beginning to be in agreement with the end. This kind of thing happens in virtually every novel, where when the author reaches the end he goes back and revises to make the whole thing work as a piece, and obviously the parts written earliest will require the most revision. You don't see this process when a book isn't published until the entire thing is complete, but when a story is published episodically, you're often seeing part of it before the whole thing is completed. Stephen King eventually completely rewrote the first book of his Dark Tower series. He added about 35 pages, but also generally changed the style of the prose to match the style that he would eventually use in the later volumes, and he made a lot of changes to details of the world to match the world as it eventually developed, and to fix continuity problems that would arise with the later books. The changes Stephen King made to the Dark Tower weren't him changing his mind so much as just naturally continuing to work on the story. Whenever you're writing one page of a novel, you're actually still working on all the pages, because you're thinking about how they'll all fit together in the end when the whole thing is one piece. As I've shown many examples of now, the idea that after an audience sees a piece of art it somehow becomes sacrosanct and can no longer be altered, that's not a thing. That's something that Star Wars fans imagine. And when you're working on any long piece, revising the earlier parts so it all works together is an obviously necessary part of the process, and there's no reason that should change just because an audience has seen a portion of the work while it's still in progress. Because out of the movies A New Hope was released when the least of its corresponding episodes were completed, it makes perfect sense that the most revisions would be done to that movie over the years, and you can see why A New Hope is the one that has 9 or more versions, whereas Revenge of the Sith basically only has 1.
I don't know an artist around that doesn't go back and touch their work up years later if they have the opportunity, especially painters. And of course, theater is that way. Most people go back and either rewrite stuff or repaint stuff or fix it a little bit. The issues are ultimately in terms of society is whether it's okay for other people to go in and start changing things and then still put that artist's name on it. You know, say it's a George Lucas film when somebody else has gone in and recut it and changed it and put different music on it. And that's a big issue now. And personally, I think that as long as the artist can continue to have the enthusiasm to refine the work, they should do it. But I don't think that studios or other people should be allowed to go and tamper with something just because they want to put it on television, or they want to take it from black and white to color, or they want to have a more contemporary score on it.
So since what Lucas is doing with the changes to Star Wars obviously isn't unique, why is the reaction when he does it so different? With the 4K versions of Peter Jackson's Middle-earth movies, he's done something very similar, but he hasn't received remotely the backlash that Lucas received.
Being able to tweak individual colours and that's the sort of thing we just couldn't do 20 years ago. So it's fun to have all the toys now, which I didn't have all this stuff to play with in the old days. So what this 4K HDR, which is high dynamic range remastering has done, has allowed me to make them look and sound consistent. They now feel like it's one big long film telling the same story and looking and sounding the same. You know, it's great to be able to have all the films looking like they were shot at the same time, finally. One of the things we found, which we weren't really expecting, is once we converted the Lord of the Rings films to 4K and HDR, the imperfections of the visual effects started to show. And when they became, ultra crisp and sharp with the 4K process, we realized that in some of the shots we're not holding up too well. So we got the opportunity to go back and to remove and paint out any imperfections. I should make it clear we didn't upgrade or enhance any of the effect shots. They're exactly the same as you're used to seeing them, except they do look as if they were done today rather than 20 years ago. Because really, this process, the way I see it, is it's not about making the film different. It's simply taking a 20-year-old movie and making it feel like it's a modern film.
When Peter Jackson says it's not about updating or changing them, it's just about making them feel like they were made today. What does that even mean? It's doublespeak that means we did change what we wanted to change. We just know that there's backlash against the George Lucas special editions, so we want you to think that this isn't like that. It is like that. The goal here is even exactly the same, which is to take two trilogies made over a long period of time and make them feel like one continual piece. I would just argue that George Lucas does a much better job of it and is much more true to a consistent intention over the course of the films. With Peter Jackson's Middle-earth movies, I feel like the changes are done thoughtlessly. People noted that it removed a blue tint in the movies that they didn't like, but it's actually a lot more than that. He's desaturated the colors throughout the Lord of the Rings movies, often removing warm tones as well as the blue tint, all it seems to bring them in line with his ass-ugly Hobbit movies. It's done in a haphazard way throughout the movie, not giving thought to the impact it has on individual scenes. Lothlorien suddenly looks much more mundane, Bag End seems a lot less warm and cozy, and changing the colors isn't all that he did, in spite of him openly lying about that to avoid being seen as making a special edition like Lucas did. In fact, they did do subtle improvements to the special effects that were originally done in lower resolutions than 4K, and they even did things like fixing this one shot where you originally could see the edges of Frodo's fake prosthetic hobbit leg, but now it's been digitally removed. Now, you could say that those are small changes, although I'd argue that the changes to the color timing are actually large changes. But if people don't mind changes like these, then they obviously aren't demanding that films stay completely 100% unchanged from their theatrical versions. So at what point is there an obligation to preserve the theatrical version? What about a movie like Titanic, which had a total of one change? In one shot, James Cameron replaced the sky after Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed out to him that the original starfield in the shot was inaccurate. Now, does James Cameron have an obligation to include both versions of the shot in every home video release of the movie? I'm assuming most people would say that he obviously doesn't, which is why my point is that when it comes to people's supposed devotion to film preservation, of course it's going to be selective. And what they care about preserving is just what they'd personally like to see. Really, the most significant changes that Lucas has made to Star Wars were in The Phantom Menace. He majorly extended the pod race, he replaced Yoda with the CGI version, and he reformatted the entire film to show almost 10% more image than was in the previous releases. Now, those are big changes, but the people demanding that the original versions of the original trilogy are released aren't concerned about those changes because the people who don't like Lucas also don't really like The Phantom Menace.
Not only did Star Wars have a huge impact on the movie industry, with its groundbreaking visual effects and sound design, but it's also become an important part of not only American but also global culture. And I'm convinced that the special edition greatly diminishes the immense historical value of these films.
Yeah, I do get mad when I talk about, the few times you'll see me, if you were at one of those festival screenings where I got kind of intense a little bit at the Q&As, is when we really start talking about the cultural heritage that Star Wars is and why don't we have those movies properly restored. That makes me mad. I think considering the love and the passion and the money that we've given this guy over, 3+ decades, and then on a larger scale, it's like, fine, even if you say he doesn't owe it to his fans, I think he owes it to culture. I think he owes it to our historical, cultural heritage. And that is that.
I bring all this up because in order to emphasize that they aren't just being selfish and make it seem like that it's not just about what they personally want, people arguing for the original versions of Star Wars will often say that what they're really concerned about is film preservation. They try to make it into a moral issue. So I know that some people would take what I'm saying to seem as though I don't really care about film preservation or film history. The truth is that I'm probably much, much more militant about film preservation than most people are.
There is, out in the world, not among professionals, but among ordinary people, there is, I think, the general notion that not only has everything been preserved, but it's all available on the internet or on DVD through Netflix or whatever. Even though there might be 40 or 50,000 DVDs out there, this is only a very, very small proportion of all the films that have been produced. 50% of all films are already lost. If we're looking at the silent era, 90 to 95% are lost. And so even though this medium is relatively young, the losses are as great as antique pottery.
America produced more films in the 20th century than the rest of the world combined, and we have the worst rate of preservation and conservation.
In the late 1890s, the nitrocellulose film was developed. After a lot of, starts and stops, they finally get this 35 millimeter film stock, and they start making films on it. The major problem with nitrate is that it is very flammable. And when I say very flammable, I mean it is very flammable. It'll burn very fast, and once it starts burning, you cannot put it out. The other reason a lot of them don't survive, of course, is just because the studios didn't really care about them. They were just product, and once they were done and made their money, they went on the shelf.
MGM had all its films stored on its lots in concrete bunkers. No air conditioning in those days, and I found in going out in the summertime it was over 125 degrees in those bunkers. And it occurred to me that that might not be good for the film. Why had that not occurred to anybody else? I haven't the slightest idea.
The nitric acid begins to leach out of the film. It creates a very strong gas. And if the film is in a can, of course, the gas just kind of sits in there and it kind of stews in its own juices. They look like little droplets of honey will begin to squeeze up from between the wraps of the film. And then those begin to harden into a crust, and then the film breaks down into a fine brown powder, and that's all she wrote.
Media is fragile. Film is fragile. It doesn't last forever. Videotape is even more fragile. And digital bits. I mean, we haven't figured out a way to save digital bits beyond a few years. If you collect material that's digital, you have to keep migrating to the next generation carrier. What happens to all your floppy disks right now? What happens to your zip drives? So by its very nature, moving images and all sort of time-based media are indeed ephemeral.
What we discovered is that huge amounts of materials would be copied to digital formats and then discarded with the belief that the digital copies would last forever. And that's not the case.
Not only are the majority of silent films lost, an increasing number of movies, even just from the last few decades, are lost as the small companies that own them go out of business and nobody is interested in distributing them. Indie movies without a large financial incentive to remaster them for streaming, and movies filmed digitally where the rights holders aren't paying to preserve them properly, are especially vulnerable.
50% of all films are already lost. If we're looking at the silent era, 90 to 95% are lost.
And the one classic film that we don't have is Star Wars.
Yet somehow this guy here thinks that Star Wars is the only movie that we don't have, even when we actually do have it. I'm talking about movies that are lost altogether, which Star Wars in none of its versions really has been. If by movies that we don't have, he means movies that we don't have 4K restorations of for every conceivable version and edit, then we're talking about the vast, vast majority of films that have ever been made. But this guy doesn't know about those. He knows about Star Wars, or he knows a little bit about Star Wars anyway. And aside from the movies that have been lost or that don't have a distributor, there are also those movies that are owned by major companies like Disney that they just choose not to release. I mean, how soon do you think we're going to get a 4K home video release of Captain EO?
The cosmos, a universe of good and evil, where a small group struggles to bring freedom to the countless worlds of despair. A ragtag band, led by the infamous Captain EO.
Or how about a 4K reissue of Song of the South?
Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay.
When do you think we're going to get the uncensored theatrical version of Fantasia? What about something like the Mickey Mouse cartoon Runaway Brain? In that case, it's not even racist or anything. It's just kind of dark and weird, and Disney doesn't like it, so it's almost never released.
Oh my! Oh, what would Mickey think?
But again, in spite of the many, many, many movies like this that I can name, Philippe seems to think somehow that Star Wars is the only one that we don't have.
And the one classic film that we don't have is Star Wars.
That's so dumb!
When they talk about how 90% of silent films have been lost, a lot of that was accidental. There were fires and things. People didn't understand then the best way to preserve it. But actually, a sickening amount of the loss was actually deliberate. Studios threw movies into the ocean. They burned their own back catalogs because they didn't feel like paying for storage fees to keep it around. In cases like The Magnificent Ambersons, where they fucked up an artist's work, they often deliberately destroyed the original version so that the artist would never be able to make them change it back. I think this is worse than unethical. I think it should actually be criminal. Personally, I don't think that any film studio should be allowed to own the distribution rights to any film unless they commit to properly preserving it. They're the stewards of our cultural heritage. In time, they'll be gone and ownership of the work will pass to somebody else or into the public domain, and they don't have any right to rob those future people of the work, if they even have a right to control it now, which they often only have through very dubious rationalizations. Look at something like the recent Universal fires, where huge swaths of 20th century musical history just went up like a match because the idiots who owned the master recordings didn't see the profit in properly fireproofing their buildings. I think there should be consequences for that. They're stealing from us, from future generations, on the pretext that they were able to get distribution rights for art by taking advantage of young artists who couldn't have their art recorded and distributed otherwise without selling the rights to it. I think any company that owns exclusive rights to any art should be subject to inspection, and if that art isn't being properly preserved and cared for, ownership should revert to the original artist or to a public institution properly funded to take care of it if it isn't possible for the original artist to do so. I think that every single element that they have should be scanned and saved at the highest possible resolution for posterity, even if it's unlikely to ever be released. I think it's a sickness in our culture how we view art only as a product, and people don't see anything wrong with letting private corporations own our cultural history and often destroy or disregard it when they don't see an immediate profit potential from it. So, I mean, those are my opinions on the preservation of art history. If you think that my support for the special editions means that I don't care about it, I do care a lot. But the purpose of preserving art history is to preserve the intentions of the artists and to show you what they intended to make, and to preserve the work as it was intended to be seen. In addition to the scenes that Kubrick removed himself from his movies after they were released, he was also famous for shooting hundreds of takes sometimes, and he also destroyed most of that footage because he didn't want it to be seen. Now, that personally makes me really sad because I'd love to see all that, but I absolutely understand his position as an artist. As a person making the film, his job is to decide how the story is told to you, how you see each moment. So why would he want you to see takes that he thought were bad or wrong or that he didn't like or that didn't represent his intentions? Now, if Kubrick, as the artist who made it, was of a disposition to save all that, but then a studio came along later and decided that they wanted to save a little rent money on storage space, and so they threw it all into the ocean, that, I think, would absolutely be a fucking crime. The two situations of a studio disrespecting an artist's work and an artist deciding on the fate of his own work are not the same. People who like to trash Lucas over the special editions are really fond of using this quote here. Lucas said at one point, "People who alter or destroy works of art and our cultural heritage for profit or as an exercise of power are barbarians, and if the laws of the United States continues to condone this behavior, history will surely classify us as a barbaric society." When people quote this to use it against Lucas, they think this makes him sound like a hypocrite, but what it actually shows is that they don't know anything about the rest of the quote or when or why he said it. Lucas said this when he was testifying to Congress about corporations colorizing movies in their back catalog after the original filmmakers have died and can no longer give consent. The people quoting this don't use the rest of the quote, where Lucas continued by saying, "American law does not protect our painters, sculptors, recording artists, authors, or filmmakers from having their life work destroyed and their reputation ruined. If something is not done now to clearly state the moral rights of artists, current and future technologies will alter, mutilate, and destroy for future generations the subtle human truths and highest human feeling that talented individuals within our society have created." The point here that Lucas was making with this speech was that artists should always have the final say over the preservation of their own work, not audiences or the corporations that own the work. Even more specifically, Lucas said to Wired magazine in 1999, "Everybody signs on to bring forth the director's vision. That's part of the way movies are made and always have been. The real issue is whether a corporation that buys the film 10 years later on has the right to change it. My response continues to be no. Since in this case Lucas is talking about the right of artists to decide how their work is presented, trying to use these quotes to say that he has an obligation to present a version of his work that he considers inferior is of course completely idiotic. And yet fanboys take half a quote out of context constantly to try to do exactly that, to use it to mean the exact opposite of what Lucas was trying to say with this.
And you have a thing about artist rights. I know you're trying to work with Congress on that.
What artist rights we're fighting for is the ability of corporations and executives in those corporations to alter movies for their own whim, to just change them, to take a black and white movie, make it color, make a widescreen movie small, to re-edit it, to take out a certain political concern or whatever, or to add a different music score, to add a pop score instead of a classical score and those sort of things in order to make it more commercial, in order to maybe find another market for it. Those things should be left to the filmmaker. The filmmaker should decide what happens to their work, not a nameless, faceless corporation. And right now, the way the law reads, any corporation can change any movie any way they want, and it would be lost forever to the rest of the society. And this is part of our heritage.
When fans run out of ways to try to claim that they want the original versions of the movies out of concern over historical preservation, another favorite approach is to say that it's disrespectful to the other artists and collaborators on the movies for Lucas to change or not use their work.
George Lucas may be the brainchild behind Star Wars.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
But everyone who participated in making those films had some type of creative input. Some of those effects are stripped out and replaced with CGI enhancements, if you want to call them that. I think that that's really disrespectful to the people who worked on those models and did those shots.
This, of course, is even more ridiculous than the other claims. People like the professional fanboy Harmy, who made the despecialized editions, love to harp on this idea that Lucas has some sort of obligation to preserve the historic effects work that was done on the film. This is obviously total nonsense. Every movie has outtakes. Every effects shot has work-in-progress versions of it before the final version that you see in the finished film. Does Lucas have an obligation to use every take an actor does for a scene? The director is always the final arbiter of what work by his collaborators is used in the final movie, or at least he should be. There's always vast amounts of work that's done as part of the process that isn't in the final version of the film. And everybody working on the film knows it. They know that not every scrap of material that they make is going to be used. Like Lucas said in the quote from Wired, everybody signs on to bring forth the director's vision. Now when I say that, at some point the next thing people will point out is that Lucas wasn't the director on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi.
Unquestionably, Lucas owns all the Star Wars movies, but Richard Marquand and
Irvin
Kershner are the directors, and
right.
Of course both of those men are now dead. Even though Lucas owns the rights to the movies, or owns the movies outright, it was their artistic vision. So does he have the right to do that?
I think if you know anything about the production of these movies, though, you'll know that that's a facile point.
I've tried to make movies where I step away, to sort of Empire and Return of the Jedi.
Right.
And after about a couple of weeks, I knew I couldn't do that. I had to stand over the shoulder of the director, help him, whisper in his ear constantly, no, do this, do that, and be there to help guide it. And it was much harder than if I just directed it myself. Richard Marquand was the director of the film. He'd done some great suspense films and was really good at working with actors. And these movies, by this time, had gotten to be more like television shows. The hierarchy and the way a television show works creatively is very much different than the way it works on a motion picture. The executive producer pretty much is the overall creative overseer of the project and comes up with the ideas for the scripts and works on the scripts, and the directors just try to fulfill the obligation of getting it on the screen, where mostly in feature films a lot of the creative control really lies in the director. It's not so much today as it was then, but I've discovered over the years that it's easy to collaborate with directors if there's mutual respect about what you're doing and a kind of general agreement on the sensibility of where you're going with something, or what kind of a film it's going to be, or what the tone of it is going to be. If you can agree on those sorts of things in the beginning before you start off, it works out pretty well. I actually had a great time working with Richard Marquand. He's a very talented director and a very nice guy. He'd never done a film of this scale before with special effects and all that sort of thing. So Just as on Empire Strikes Back, I was there to assist and help and sort of give my expertise. These films are so huge that it's really hard to do it by yourself. I mean, you really need to have a lot of people to support you in all the areas. Fortunately, in this one, especially in the art department and a lot of the other departments, we were using the same group that we'd used before. In special effects, it was the same group. So it was easier for me to shorthand with a lot of people. And that became a real asset for Richard because, you know, I could just say, don't worry about that, we'll take care of it. So a lot of the technical complications and everything, he didn't really even have to worry about. He just focused on, you know, getting the performances out of the actors and making sure the story got told on the set. You know, we had that cooperative relationship where if I said, just do it like this and don't worry about it, you know, he was curious about what was going to happen, but he didn't sort of spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel or say, no, I don't want to do it that way, because, you know, I say, look, if this is the way you do this, it's much easier. Let's just do this because that'll all be a map painting anyway. It's very easy, especially at this stage in special effects where it was relatively new, to get hung up trying to figure out how things were going to actually come out. The only way you ever really know that is having gone through it a few times. And you can sort of anticipate where everything's going to be. A film like this operates on a lot of faith. You know, the actors have to have faith. In this case, the director had to have a lot of faith that it would actually come together and all the missing pieces would mysteriously appear in post-production.
The directors of Empire and Jedi certainly obviously made valuable contributions, especially Kirshner, and Lucas is always the first to acknowledge those contributions. If anything, part of the problem with how the production of these movies is perceived is that Lucas has always been generous to a fault when giving credit to his collaborators. He gave Leigh Brackett writing credit on Empire, even though they didn't use a single word of her draft, because he liked her and she gave her best effort in spite of being ill, and she died before they could finish her work. But because of the fact that he was kind enough to give her a credit and acknowledge her involvement, I still see people who don't like to give Lucas credit for anything, imagining that things that they like in Empire are actually from her contributions. This is simply not true. The production of the Star Wars movies is probably more documented than the production of just about any other movie series in film history. So if you want to, you can find these things out. People just don't really want to.
What if you came up higher and tighter so that you could get the dunes behind him?
I've mentioned before J.W. Rinsler's Making of Star Wars series of books, which is a really great series of behind-the-scenes books, which I'll use this opportunity to recommend again. In those books, he provides details of the various drafts of the movies, walks point by point through when important changes occurred, and he even has access to things like transcripts of story conference meetings, so you can really see exactly where each idea came from and who came up with it. People who don't like giving Lucas credit also like to imagine that Lawrence Kasdan did everything that's good in Empire, but in these books you can see that Lucas came to Kasdan with an almost complete plan for Empire, nearly scene-by-scene breakdown with even some of the dialogue already there, and Kasdan basically did a dialogue polish on Lucas's outline. Lawrence Kasdan was not the originator for the story ideas in Empire Strikes Back. If you want to see what Star Wars looks like with just Lawrence Kasdan and no George Lucas, go watch Solo, and you'll see that it's not pretty.
I don't have people. I'm alone.
Solo.
So, we know and it's well documented that Lucas came up with the whole story. He was involved in every page of the screenplay. We know he was already working with artists to generate designs and concept art before Irvin Kershner, the director, was even involved. So, pre-production was pretty much top to bottom Lucas's vision. Kershner's major contribution was to work with the actors, and he did a great job with that. But even during filming, Lucas was often on the set. As things fell behind in schedule and grew over budget, Lucas was there more, often working a lot with technical things, like he was there for some of the Yoda scenes, while Kershner might be focused more on the actors with parts like the Han and Leia scenes. So there are parts in the movie that were filmed when Kershner wasn't even present. And then, of course, after principal photography, post-production and editing and special effects work was all overseen by Lucas. Lucas had the final say on everything. Kershner has even said himself that he didn't know much about the special effects, and Lucas said, don't worry about that, he would do it.
To me, editing is what filmmaking is really all about. All the other times you're sort of generating material or supplies. It's like making a film is like buying lumber or cutting down trees and making wood out of it. Where editing is like actually constructing a house. You actually can see it, you can see what you're doing and deal with it. Everybody says, well, the script doesn't work, but we'll fix it later. And they say, well, we're shooting this, but it isn't really working, but we'll fix it in the editing. Well, the editing is where it's got to be fixed. If it doesn't work there, the movie doesn't work. So that's, to me, the most exciting part. These battle sequences are created almost totally through the editorial process. We run through, there's like pilots that were shot blue screen, and then animatics, and then footage that was shot in Norway. And what I did is used the animatics as something to fill in, so I could actually cut the whole sequence and finish it. And I cut this really while I was here, while they were still shooting in England. I was here and I cut the snow battle and did all the animatics and all that kind of stuff.
The fact that Lucas is always generous with crediting other people is how the fans are able to imagine that those people did everything. But if you learn about the productions in detail, obviously everything came from Lucas. On the movies where he was only a producer, he was actually doing far more work on these movies than a lot of directors are doing on their movies. He was working on designs, doing the editing, working on every draft of the script and storyboards. The directors were hired to make Lucas's movies for him, and they understood that. So again, this isn't to take away from Kirshner's work, which is obviously important, but he was a lot more like an assistant director who was there to work with the actors. Like Lucas said, the production was just so large that he didn't think he could be there on set for every day, so he developed a structure that was more like TV, where the showrunner is the creative force, or you could say the auteur, and the directors are working within those guidelines. And even though Kirshner worked on that movie knowing full well that Lucas would have final say over the finished project, it's also disingenuous to suggest that with the later changes to the movie, Lucas was doing things that were against Kirshner's wishes. Kirshner also had things in the original release that he wasn't satisfied with due to time and budget and other reasons, and some of the changes to the special editions were actually done to address his concerns. For one example, Kirshner was always unhappy that the interior sets of Cloud City were so claustrophobic and that they couldn't have more open views, and when Lucas added windows looking out onto the city in those shots, he described the addition as a gift for Kirshner and called him in to see the work that had been done. So not only were they changes that Lucas thought Kirshner would like, Lucas was having conversations with him about it.
I had a long talk with George, and he said, we're going to put in a snow monster that you never had. So you're going to see a few seconds of the snow monster that knocks Mark off the Tauntaun.
Star Wars, we had this kind of low-budget, young director and all this kind of problems that we had to cope with, which made the film less than what it could be. With Kirshner and Empire, it was a much better situation, and we had a lot more resources, and Kirsh's a great director, so we didn't really have to change too much. Most of what we changed, one, were some things like Cloud City, which Kirsh was complaining on the set, and I was saying, look, they're just not going to let us have any more set because, it's cost too much, and the idea of putting in digital backgrounds, that didn't exist then. You wouldn't even think about doing something like that. So a lot of the same thing with a snow monster, We tried to have a snow monster. We built a snow monster. It just looked terrible. And it was Kirshner, said, we can't let this stay in here. I said, you're right, it's terrible. So we cut it out. We had somebody else do another little tiny puppet that we used just marginally to give you the impression of a monster. But we all wanted to have that monster in there. And a lot of these things are things you want on the set that you have to make compromises for. And you say, now we're going to do it the way we wanted to do it then.
Other contributors were also open to the later changes. We also know that Frank Oz was consulted and approved of the digital Yoda.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's great, George.
Things are definitely changing.
You don't need me, for God's sake.
We'll always need you.
John Williams was also on board with the idea of continuing to change the movies to make them work together as a piece. He's even said that he suggested to Lucas that he change some of the score in A New Hope so that it would include the Imperial March so that the theme develops logically over the 6 episodes, in spite of the fact that it wasn't originally written until they made Empire Strikes Back. In spite of the perception of Lucas being unable to stop himself from obsessively changing everything, he decided not to make this change. So again, to suggest that Lucas was writing roughshod over the will of his collaborators or the film's real director is just nonsense. It's fanboys who were upset that they don't like the changes trying to sound less selfish by claiming that they're actually only offended on behalf of somebody else who has been wronged.
And I study English and American cultural studies as a part of my master's degree. And the cultural impact of the original Star Wars was actually the topic of my undergraduate thesis. And I'm convinced that the special edition greatly diminishes the immense historical value of these films.
With something like the despecialized edition, it was actually created by taking clips from all different mismatched releases of Star Wars and then using the bits that this guy Harmy happens to like best and combining them to construct his own personal preferred version. He talks about respecting the original artists involved and preserving the movie, but what he's actually making is a Frankenstein version of the movie that's much further removed from the original releases than anything that Lucas has done. The truth is that Star Wars fans don't care about preserving film history. They care about recreating their own personal experience with this one particular film. It's not about how we should preserve films in general. It's about making sure that this one particular film will always look the same way that it did when one particular viewer was 6, thrilling along to the adventure in his Darth Vader underoos. If it's important to preserve the theatrically released version, but not to preserve the versions made before theatrical release because of this idea that we have to preserve the memories of the fans who saw it, why do we need to preserve the memories of the people who saw it in 1977, but not the memories of the people that saw it at all different other points? I mean, what about the memories of the people who first saw A New Hope in 1997 with the special edition, and now when they see it, Jabba the Hutt has been changed from what they remember? What about the memories of people who originally saw it as a rough cut in a preview screening with some incomplete special effects? Does Lucas somehow owe it to them to release that particular rough cut for the sake of their memories? The idea that somehow when an audience sees it, that means that it's now become frozen and it should be immutable is just ridiculous. Obviously, nobody would ever suggest that Lucas has an obligation to release every edit of a film that was made before the film was released. So why should he be obliged to release every edit that was made after release? Why do people think that an audience seeing it in some way freezes it at that point? I mean, what about the 3 different sound mixes from A New Hope's original theatrical release? Does Lucas have a moral obligation to include all 3 of those in every home video release? My point is that you can see where this is an endless thing, and saying just release the original versions is really kind of meaningless. When people say history, what they actually mean is the version of the film that they have a personal connection to. What they're actually saying is that out of 9 possible edits, they should be the one who's allowed to decide which one is the real one, not George Lucas. The truth is that all movies and most art changes over time. Anytime you have to release a movie on a new format with new audio equipment or whatever, it requires creative choices to adapt to the new technology. Anytime you see a movie, you're never seeing it exactly as it would have appeared to its first audience. Celluloid is a physical object. It ages over time, and the ways in which we present and restore movies evolve as well. Most of the changes with Star Wars, like different takes of different sound effects or whatever, are simply the kind of thing that's going to happen when they're making new versions and new sound mixes to best utilize new equipment. The goal when making these changes should always be to stick to the intention of the original artists. It's misguided now how people want everything to look like it was filmed yesterday for their brand new 8K TV. But when the original artist is still around and he's the one deciding how to adapt the movies, it's his choice how he wants to adapt to the changes. In both cases, whether the original artist is still involved or not, the guidance should be to present the movie as he would want it, not change it to meet the demands of the audience.
But people get very covetous of the material, not just the people involved, but the audience as well. And they feel like they should have a say in how it should all be done and how they should, be executed. You have to remember who's the captain of the ship. And like I say, it always came back to fulfilling George's vision and making him happy. If he's happy, we were happy.
The main point of everything that I've been trying to say so far is that Lucas has the right to change the movies however he wants, and that it's not unusual or strange for an artist to do things like this. The point is that it's an immature audience reaction to fight it and to think that he should release the movies how the audience wants. Art isn't a democracy, or at least it wasn't before trash like the Marvel movies started taking over the box office. Creative decisions should not be done by a vote. So whether or not the fans like a particular change is an irrelevant argument and completely beside the point. But in the end, of course, that's the argument that they'll keep having. So now I'm going to give in and go into the debates around the most contentious changes in the movies. I think the fact that Star Wars fans have gotten to know different versions of the movies means that they're opinionated about editorial choices that, if they had only ever seen the movies one way, they wouldn't even think about. These are such minor things. But the thing is that despite the fact that I think these debates are irrelevant as to the issue of the validity of the special editions, if you really want to examine the changes to the films in good faith, it's pretty obvious that they actually aren't problems at all. The fans become vociferously opinionated on tiny, tiny aesthetic choices. Things that I don't think ever would have been noticed if people weren't presented with multiple versions become blown out of proportion, and you have people trying to claim that they completely ruin a scene or a character or even the entire movie. The fans pick on these tiny, tiny things and often deliberately misconstrue them because they're starting with the conclusion that they know more about the movies than Lucas does, and then working backward from that conclusion to try to accumulate evidence to support it. One example I really like of the ridiculous kind of thing that people obsess over are the rocks added in front of R2-D2 in Obi-Wan's first scene in A New Hope for the Blu-ray.
That new shot that was released, right, that we're going to have on the Blu-ray release of R2-D2 hiding behind more rocks in a way that he couldn't possibly have squeezed in there. I mean, where's the logic there? What does it do? Like, how does it improve the film in any way?
This is the kind of thing where it really seems to me like people are being deliberately thick to create a complaint just because they enjoy complaining so much. It's important to them to find flaws with what Lucas is doing to discredit it. First, you see people say that it's a pointless change to the scene and that they don't understand the reason for it and it's unnecessary, when in reality, I mean, the reason for this change is incredibly obvious. In the scene, right, Obi-Wan is supposed to not notice R2 until R2 makes a noise, and yet in the original version, R2 is just standing right out in the open and he would have been impossible to miss. This is the type of problem that would have come up on the original shoot for A New Hope, which was notoriously troubled and rushed. They wouldn't have had time to perfectly set up the shots with R2 or, to move rocks around or to create the perfect space for him. So they grabbed the best shots that they could. The second unit might have even done it when Lucas couldn't be there. So you get shots that it'll serve its purpose, but it's not ideally planned out. So adding the rocks was an easy way to make the moment make a little bit more sense. The other complaint that people give about it is that the rocks don't leave enough room for R2 to get in and out of the cave. Again, I feel like this must be people being deliberately dense to create things to complain about, because we never see enough of the cave to know that there isn't another way to the side of the rocks where R2 could have been getting in and out of his hiding place. We only see R2 in his hiding place in tight shots that don't show the sides of the rocks. When R2 comes out after Obi-Wan sees him, we see rocks behind him that might have been where he was hiding, but we never see him exit his hiding place, so it's not really clear. It's the type of thing that, had this scene originally been like this, nobody would have ever thought about it. People only complain because they have two versions of the shots to compare, and they want to find fault with the changed version.
But the thing that really bugs me about this particular scene, but the thing that bugs me, if you look at it, is the very first shot of it, right before the song starts. You see Size Noodles in the background, and it's the real Size Noodles that we've seen, as kids, and she has the feather, and then you cut away, and then the song starts, and you cut to her, and she enters, and it's the CGI Size Noodles without a feather. And I'm like, so there's, you spend $1 million.
All that money.
Right, all that money on that scene, and you don't even, like, this glaring continuity mistake, it doesn't matter.
This is another one of the types of things where it's like, I can't believe people are being serious when they complain about this.
But the thing that really bugs me.
I mean, can adult people actually be concerned about her having a feather in one shot and not in another shot? I get that it's a continuity issue because you're using the puppet in one shot and it looks different than the CGI version, but it's such a quick little moment when you see the puppet and she's so small in the frame that you have to be looking for things to complain about in order to even find it. You probably have to be a big Star Wars nerd to even realize that this is supposed to be the same character as the CGI character in the first place. In the Jabba's Palace scenes, there's a million puppets and creatures running around in every shot. How many normal audience members know all of their names and are tracking the continuity of how they look from shot to shot? I mean, I know all of their names, but that's because I'm a loser, right? I realize it's not normal for people to know the name of Sice Noodles or the other band members. If anything, aside from the fact that it's not necessary, I would assume that Lucas didn't put the CGI version in the shot because it would have been difficult to blend it in convincingly and difficult to paint out the old version. Or maybe he even left in the original puppet there for one moment as sort of an homage to the original version of the character. Either way, it's such a tiny moment. I can't believe it's something that people actually managed to get worked up about. If you look at all the changes that Lucas makes to the movies, you'll start to notice that, contrary to this idea of him being obsessive and a perfectionist, there are many, many small imperfections like this in the special effects throughout the movies that he could fix, but he doesn't. I think this tells you something about his thinking. He's not trying to fix every tiny little thing. He's trying to fix things that he thinks have some effect on the story and change the meanings of the movies or their believability, or that'll have an effect on the viewing experience of the audience.
A lot of these things went through a lot of incarnations. I mean, the singer originally was a marionette, could barely move, and really couldn't do what I'd wanted. Some of the other characters who were more static were able to come off pretty well, but Jabba can't really move in this one. He's stuck on a slab. Piano player and some of those people are stuck on slabs because they're puppets. And so it's as you push the technology forward, you're able to get the creatures suddenly to walk or raise their arms or have expressions on their faces. And all that took years and years and a lot of experimentation and technical advances to just be able to get an alien character to be real. In this particular case, you make the tongue work. Or the eyes work. That was like a major breakthrough. To be able to make eyelids move up and down and eyes move back and forth and the tongue go in and out. And the lips be relatively in sync. And I'm still amused by people that somehow think that when you use cyber technology or digital technology in movies, it's fake. But when you look at a scene in here, like Jabba's palace, now there's some digital characters in here, but they're no more or less fake than all the other characters that are in here. I mean, is a digital character more fake than a big fat rubber character? I mean, there's nothing real here at all. And it's hard to say that, a rubber character has more integrity than a digital character. What I try to do is just make the characters become believable. So they look realistic enough to where you have a suspension of disbelief and accept them as characters, not as tricks, which is what they all are.
Something like the Ewoks blinking would have been important to him because he felt the faces looked too much like masks. He wanted them to look more alive. But he's not going through and animating the eyes on every single Ewok. He's just concerned about giving the general impression that they're alive. It's very easy to see why you'd want to do that, but of course, fans think the Ewok blinks, even though they're only in a few shots, are another example of his obsessively changing everything and of him being insane. Another change that really seems to make people lose their shit is Vader yelling no in Return of the Jedi. I mean, first, if you want more detail on my thoughts on this, in the first part of the series, I talk a lot more about the repeated moments between the movies, and a character yelling no like that is a key moment that happens in every Star Wars film. So not having the no yell in Return of the Jedi was an odd exception before, and now that there's one in there, it fits with the other episodes better. People complain about the no in Revenge of the Sith also, of course.
For God's sake, George, you have got to fix the ending where Vader says, "No!" I think it would be better if Vader is just standing there, growling at the top of his voice like, and then maybe you can have some sparks coming out of his throat as his brand new, voice,
I mean, you'll notice that the exact same kind of fans in the People vs. George Lucas movie who say that Lucas has no right to change the original trilogy will also then demand that he make changes to the things that they don't like in the prequels. Again and again and again, they illustrate that they don't actually object to changing the movies. They just want to be the ones deciding what gets changed. But the issue of both times that Vader yells no, both of which fans complain about, are connected. It's an example of Lucas making these two moments similar to call attention to how the moments are connected. The first time Vader's yell is helpless as he hears that Padme is dead, right? And it's too late to save her. The second time he sees that Luke's about to die, but this time he's not helpless, and he decides that he's going to finally do the right thing and prevent somebody's death. Vader changing like this and learning to be selfless is what ultimately saves him. It's important to the whole arc of the whole series to go from one no to the other and show how he's changed between these two moments. But more than that, this complaint shows how selective the critics of both the special editions and the prequels are with what they do and don't complain about. You know that they're just looking for things to bitch about when they think that Vader's no in Revenge of the Sith or his no in Return of the Jedi is just, beyond the pale and suddenly the movies are silly, but they don't think there's anything melodramatic or over the top about this moment. If If you understand the way that Lucas is working and the way that he likes to repeat details and time moments from the movies together, the Vader knows have an extremely obvious purpose. The only way they seem out of place is if you're looking at them independently from looking at how and why Lucas is making these movies the way that he is. Another example I like is people trying to make an issue of the change to the establishing shot of the door of Jabba's palace, which makes the door seem bigger now. People point this out as another stupid, sloppy continuity mistake resulting from Lucas not caring, because they say it makes the door bigger on the outside than on the inside. I mean, except the thing is, we never actually see how big the full door is on the inside. So there is no continuity error. Go ahead, go back and check the shots of the door from the inside if you don't believe me. They only show a portion of the door from the inside. Complaining about this is like the R2's rocks thing. It's continuity error only for the types of fans that are obsessively going over these changes frame by frame, and yet somehow in spite of doing that, they're still not paying attention. There's an article about the special editions by a guy named Drew Stewart, which I think is useful, but not necessarily for the reasons that he might think it is. To give credit where it's due, Drew has done quite a lot of research into the changes to the movies, going through some scenes literally frame by frame to find differences that resulted from the recompositing between different versions that I don't think many people have ever found before. Finding these changes is interesting, but I think where his article is really instructive is in the way in which it shows how people who demand the theatrical versions of the original trilogies think about these things. He doesn't think that these are just tiny changes that are introduced as an artist revisits and polishes a piece of work. No, they're cataclysmic things that completely, and I'm quoting here, break the movies. Further to that, fans that think this way are able to read Lucas's mind and determine conclusively that these changes are made out of a combination of sloppiness and a lack of understanding of the movies, which the fans commenting on the changes obviously must understand much more deeply than Lucas does. While Drew tries to argue that he objects to the changes because they supposedly quote-unquote break the movies and ruin the story, he admits that the main reason that these changes bother him so much is that he doesn't like the prequels and doesn't want to be reminded of them. He says, "One cannot watch the classic films now without constant reminders of the movies that a lot of fans would prefer to forget." This is one of many confirmations of my theory that people's claims of the special editions harming the movies are more about their dissatisfaction with the prequels and with Lucas rather than with the merits of the particular changes themselves. It's a fundamental conceit of the prequels and also all versions of the original trilogy that Lucas is viewing each of these films as one part of a larger piece and that the ultimate goal is for them all to work together.
You got to remember this is one movie and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
It really gums up the works for fans who want to pick and choose which parts of the series they want to acknowledge and which they want to ignore when the movies are fundamentally not meant to operate separately from one another. But the wishes of fans for the movies to be something other than what they are don't make those wishes come true. While admitting to the obvious motives behind the changes, like making the movies tie together better with the prequels, Drew also launches into endless, baseless speculation about Lucas's reasoning. The fact that some of the changes also serve to test out new technology that would go on to be used in the prequels doesn't mean that was the only reason that Lucas was making the changes, but it's what Drew attributes a lot of the changes to. Like I keep pointing out, it's really easy to see the story purposes behind any of these changes, and many of them were things that Lucas was interested in doing way back in 1977, and he made additional similar changes to the movies after the prequels were finished. But for Drew, somehow everything goes back to his obsession that the prequels ruined everything. I don't understand why people would think that Lucas would do something to the original movies if he thought it damaged them, purely because it would benefit the prequels. Obviously, he's not putting in changes that he thinks are bad, and he went back and changed the prequels just as much as he did the originals. So where does this idea come from that somehow he doesn't care about the original as much as the prequels and will vandalize one for the sake of the other? As I've already demonstrated, there's no other possible motivation for most of these changes other than Lucas feeling that they make the movies better. There's no other benefit to them. Unsurprisingly, as Drew's obsessed with finding ways to say that minute changes somehow break the movies, he's also obsessed with there being a rock in front of R2 in a couple of shots. He first says that there's no creative reason for the rocks to be there, even though the reason of R2 needing to be hidden is stunningly obvious. And then a sentence later, he inadvertently admits that he knows why the rocks are there and that they're hiding R2, because he also feels like he needs to invent some kind of bizarre headcanon about how the Tusken Raiders' goggles would somehow work so that they can't see what's directly in front of their face. He knows that the scene requires R2 to be hidden to make sense, but he thinks it's more reasonable to have an elaborate imaginary fan theory for why the Tusken Raiders might not be able to see what's right in front of their eyes, rather than to put rocks there that would hide R2-D2. But still, this kind of minute, trivial difference, like a rock being where it wasn't before, is one of the examples that Drew brings up as something so supposedly egregious that it, again I quote, breaks the movies. Another, major movie-breaking thing that Drew's a little bit obsessed over is the cry that Obi-Wan lets out to scare the Tusken Raiders off, right? Now, a lot of fans know that this cry was originally referred to as Obi-Wan making a krayt dragon call. The krayt dragon being a large and dangerous Tatooine animal, right? Whose skeleton we've seen earlier in the movie. The idea being that the sound of one approaching would scare off the Tusken Raiders. The problem with that is that it's not established in the movies what one of them sounds like, so the viewer might not guess that that's what Obi-Wan is doing. It's not a big problem because either way you can assume that Obi-Wan's making some kind of sound that frightens the Tusken Raiders for some reason. The sound was replaced with a different but similar sound. It's not really that much different, but because it's a post-1997 change, Drew says that it now sounds horrible and hilarious, and for some reason he says it reminds him of people in a bathroom. I didn't know that the echo in a bathroom has a different sound than an echo in another type of similar room, but I'm supposing Drew thinks that bathroom sounded funny, or somehow emphasizes how stupid he thinks the change is. But the funny part is that then in the next sentence, he admits that he does understand the reason for the change. The new sound that Obi-Wan makes now sounds like a boga, the lizard that Obi-Wan rides in Revenge of the Sith. So if you notice that connection, the change serves both the purpose of explaining why Obi-Wan might know how to make the sound that he's making, and it also makes the viewer understand that he's imitating a large, scary animal that might scare off the Tuskens. But the problem for Drew is that the animal happens to be from a prequel movie that he doesn't like, which is the real reason that he doesn't like the sound effects. So he develops his weird claim that it sounds funny and has something to do with bathrooms for some reason. Drew also says he somehow thinks that it ruins Boba Fett to show him in the reinstated A New Hope scene working for Jabba the Hutt. He says that this makes Boba Fett just a henchman and he's not super cool anymore. This person has written many thousands of words lecturing George Lucas on how Lucas doesn't understand the story of Star Wars, has somehow missed that Boba Fett was already working for Jabba. He was selling him Han Solo in Empire Strikes Back, and again hanging around with Jabba's henchmen in Return of the Jedi. The only things that we ever saw Boba Fett do in the original trilogy were hanging around with Jabba and helping to capture Han Solo, which he was doing partly to get a bounty from Jabba. But now Drew somehow thinks that showing Boba working for Jabba as a henchperson or hang around with Jabba somehow lessens Boba Fett's character. The distance that people will stretch to in order to make these changes into problems when they barely change anything at all is kind of truly extraordinary. He comments on the added shot of the Falcon escaping Mos Eisley and says that it serves no story purpose, and so he speculates with absolutely no basis that the CGI Falcon model was possibly built to be used in the prequels. What? I mean... It doesn't seem to occur to him that the possible story reason of showing the Falcon escaping was to, show the Falcon escaping? No, I mean, that couldn't be it. That's much too simple. It must have been those dastardly prequels infecting his precious childhood memories yet again. Even shots of things exclusively from the original trilogy are somehow for Drew about things from the prequels. It also makes no sense to claim that this scene would be added so that they could use it to build a CGI Falcon model, because the same CGI model is used several other times in the movie, so there's no reason that they would need this shot as an excuse to create it. Another interesting one that Drew brings up here that I've seen other people mention is that they don't think it makes sense in the new dialogue in the Emperor and Vader scene in Empire Strikes Back for Vader to seem surprised at the suggestion that Luke could be his son, given that the movie has established that Vader is obsessed with finding Luke.
What is thy bidding, my master?
There is a great disturbance in the Force.
I have felt it.
We have a new enemy, Luke Skywalker.
Yes, my master.
He could destroy us.
He's just a boy. Obi-Wan can no longer help him.
The Force is strong with him. The son of Skywalker must not become a Jedi.
If he could be turned, he would become a powerful ally.
Yes. Yes. He would be a great asset. Can it be done?
He will join us or die, Master.
I have no doubt this boy is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker.
How is that possible?
I don't understand how it's never occurred to people that Vader is lying when he acts surprised, given that it's revealed a short time later in the movie that Vader's whole plot in Empire Strikes Back is to get Luke to join him so they can overthrow the Emperor. How does it not occur to them that Vader might be trying to keep the reason he's hunting for Luke secret from the Emperor? Really? I mean, come on. I mean, if it's so important to Drew that he's writing this giant thing to try to find flaws in Lucas's work, at least put some effort in. Come up with something that isn't so very obviously not a mistake. Drew tries to say it doesn't make sense for Boba Fett to sound like Jango Fett, even though he's a clone of Jango Fett, because he says accents aren't genetic. I mean, so nobody ever retains the accent of the people that they grew up around? Where would Boba Fett have got a new accent, and why would he have got it? I mean, sure, it's possible for people to change accents over their life, but it's also not something that everybody does. According to Drew, this doesn't make sense, though. I mean, seriously? I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but some of these complaints I don't even have to make fun of. They just make fun of themselves. And remember, this change and the others that I'm mentioning, again, are included on a list of changes that Drew thinks are so egregious that they, again I quote, broke the movies. He simultaneously complains that adding extra shots of Cloud City was unnecessary, but then he also goes on to complain that they weren't done when there were more opportunities, stating with no evidence at this point that they just did some shots but not others to make a point, and that additional shots weren't done because they would have cost too much money. This is in spite of the fact that, I mean, dropping a CGI background that had already been rendered into a shot is extremely simple to do with digital technology, and that Lucas continued for years after this to make more changes that would have been much more elaborate and expensive. Another one that's weird to me is all the complaining I've heard about Luke's scream being added as he falls in Cloud City.
He seems to make changes to the movies where he completely doesn't understand the character.
Well, then it's also things where he'll change it and then change it back, like in Empire when...
Oh, that's the worst.
In Empire for the special edition, Luke finds out Vader's his father, he jumps down, and for the special edition, they added him going, ah! Then when they re-released it on DVD, he took that out. So it's not just that he's making changes that he thinks will improve the movie, he's changing his mind.
I could see him thinking, going, oh, he's falling and he's not making any noise, that's weird. But the whole point of the scene was that Luke, you know, he's the rebel, he's the ultimate rebel, and he... He just says no, you know, Vader's like, join me or die. And he's like, you know what,
I'd rather die.
I'm done,
Boom.
I'd rather die. And it was sort of like a self-sacrifice. It just shows that he doesn't know what's happening in the scene.
Yeah.
Or with the characters.
Or doesn't
it's
care.
amazing.
Or doesn't care what's really happening in the scene.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
so what you're saying is George Lucas has a limited mental focus, a limited intelligence.
This one is another weird one for me. Special edition detractors want to have their cake and eat it too with this, because they're complaining that the scream is being added, but then they're also making fun of the fact that it was later removed, because they use this as evidence of Lucas's incompetence, that after it was added he changed his mind. I really have no idea why people get hung up on this, because it seems to be the type of simple thing that I've described before is happening with virtually every release of these movies. Each time they're released and a new sound mix is required, certain creative choices are made.
When the special editions were made in the late 90s, we gathered together all the different mixes, went through them, got notes that George Lucas had made back at the time we finished the first film. He gave notes to me, which I saved, which were things he still wanted to change, but we never had a chance to do in the schedule. And so we remastered the film in stereo putting in all the material that was from the mono version and the stereo versions, and essentially making a more complete version. And then this brings us to the present, in which now with the release of digital tracks in homes on DVD and so on, we have gone back and remastered the film once again, actually going back to the earliest possible sources, the farthest back we can go in terms of original material, in terms of dialogue, music, and effects, in order to achieve the most original quality to everything. And we've remixed the film yet again.
As I've already shown over and over again, starting with the 3 different sound mixes that existed for A New Hope in its original theatrical release, there are a lot of sound effects or lines of dialogue that might come and go or be in and out in different versions of the movies, depending on, whatever seems creatively right to them when they're making a particular mix. So when they were making the 1997 mix, Lucas felt like maybe there should be a scream there, and so he put it in. The next time they looked at it, they were making a new mix, and he decided against it, so it went back out. Just like many, many other decisions that have come and gone with the movies over the years. I don't really see why this particular one is something to get hung up on, but if it bothered you when you put in the scream, it's gone now, so it hasn't been changed, so there's nothing to keep harping on. I don't know why they keep going back to it. Another big complaint for people is the added shots showing Vader returning to his shuttle. This is one I see people talk about a lot. People say that it ruins the pacing of the sequence. I mean, it changes the pacing of the sequence slightly, but what they mean by saying ruined is that it just isn't the same as it was before. They say it's pointless when, the point is obvious. It maybe wasn't a big flaw before that they never showed how Vader got back to his ship, but it was kind of strange that one moment he's on Cloud City and then the next time we see him, during the same action sequence with only a few minutes elapsing, suddenly he's now on the Star Destroyer. But those complaints aside, here Drew pulls a Drew again, and he speculates that the change was made so that they could use the shuttle model from this scene in the prequels and not have to pay for it, even though the model doesn't appear in the prequels, even though there's no reason that an Imperial shuttle would appear in a movie set decades prior in which there are no other Imperial ships, even though in spite of people complaining that the prequels have too much CGI, the truth is that The Phantom Menace alone had more practical models built for it than the entire original trilogy. So why would they need to add this entire elaborate sequence to Empire Strikes Back in order to create a single model for The Phantom Menace, a movie that had hundreds of ship models? Why would one additional ship, let alone one ship that they would have no reason to use in the prequels, have any significant impact on the budget for The Phantom Menace? It's total gibberish if you think about it for 1 second. But, I mean, that's beside the point, because the point here is that Drew knows, down in his heart of hearts, that he doesn't like this change, so that means that it must somehow, in some way, it must somehow have something to do with those terrible, terrible prequels. His thinking here is so bizarre because he keeps trying to claim that they added entire scenes to the movies as an excuse to build CGI models that they could then use in the prequels, even though there would be no reason for the same ships to appear in movies set in a different era. And then he also mentions that, of course, none of these models actually do appear in the prequels. He points out himself that some of what they built for the new shots of Coruscant are the only things from the 97 versions that made it into the prequels. But then he also tries to paint that as a negative by saying that the models from 97 not making it into the prequels is evidence that they were unfinished prototypes and that they shouldn't have been left in the movies. He points out as an example of this that there are a lot of Rontos in Mos Eisley in the special edition, but none in the Phantom Menace. I mean, of course, just because a creature is in one city in A New Hope doesn't mean it should be in a different city in a different period in a different movie, so that idea makes no sense either. But then the funny part of that is, if you look closely, there actually are Rontos in the Phantom Menace. As it goes on, of course, naturally Drew is upset about the door in Jabba's palace. He's upset about Vader yelling no and so on. But at a certain point, it starts to get repetitive, and none of these complaints are any more valid than the other ones, or have any real motivation besides some kind of, obsessive disdain for the prequels. But he does say what he thinks is his biggest insight for the end of the article, even though otherwise he's talking about the scenes chronologically as they appear in the movies, and this scene is from A New Hope. He thinks this one is his big coup de grace. He really kicks his drama into high gear here, saying this last change ruins the last act of A New Hope and negates everything that comes after. The other changes might have broken the movies, but this one makes it like extra super duper broken. And it's yet another thing that's barely a change to the movies at all. What he's talking about is the new shot of the X-Wings approaching the Death Star, but in terms of the information that it gives the viewers of the movies, it's really more of a combined version of two shots that were already in the movie originally. Lucas just took two shots of the X-Wings approaching, one with the cameras facing the X-Wings and one with the camera behind them, and he combined them both into one shot with the smooth pan, because before doing a camera move like that with all those ships and objects in the frame would have just been too difficult. Drew's point about how it breaks the movies, though, is that he thinks this means that since in this shot you can see both the Death Star and Yavin 4, it means that the Death Star would have been able to blast the moon already without maneuvering any closer. This claim is an especially baffling one, though, considering that there's even a graphic in the movie to illustrate the situation for the slower children in the audience. Drew even shows this graphic in his article, but he hasn't looked at it very closely. The planet, Yavin Prime, is in between the Death Star and Yavin 4, the moon with the Rebel base. The Death Star is a partial orbit of the planet away away from the moon. As the X-Wings travel toward the Death Star in an opposite orbit around the planet, in this shot, when they're partway between the Death Star and Yavin 4, obviously the camera there would be able to see the moon behind them and then turn and see the Death Star in front of them. Depending on how far above the planet they were, there's a whole area in there where with a turn, a camera would be able to see both. The further above the planet they were, the bigger the area where the camera would be able to see both the moon and the Death Star, and given how small the planet looks in frame, they were pretty far above it. But even if they were much closer to the planet, there would still be a whole range of points where you would be able to turn and see both. And if you were filming it, that would be the dramatic point where you'd want to place your shot. This is yet another mistake that Drew is proud of finding that obviously, if you think about it for even a minute, isn't a mistake. Another weird thing that he keeps doing in his article, and that I've seen other people do before, is that he keeps repeating that the original movies won Academy Awards as though this somehow makes them perfect, and that any change could only make them worse. Harmy does this too, at great length when he talks about the special effects in the original releases.
So I do believe that people should be able to view the original Oscar-winning versions of these films.
In 1978, a film called Star Wars won 7 Academy Awards. Star Wars also won an Oscar for its groundbreaking visual effects. In the 1997 re-release, most of the Oscar-winning aspects of the movie were altered. In the so-called special edition, the Oscar-winning editing was disrupted. Many of the groundbreaking Academy Award-winning special effects, even the original award-winning art direction and costume design, the original Oscar-winning sound mix was redone as well. Some of the original Oscar-winning sound effects were replaced. And John Williams' award-winning score in its original Oscar-winning form.
I mean, they won an Oscar for Best Special Effects.
Original Oscar-winning version.
Is the version of Star Wars Episode 4 the version that won the Academy Award for Best Editing?
I really kind of have to laugh at this, sort of childish obsession that they have with how many Oscars the movies won. They think that it somehow validates their obsession with the original version that it won these awards. I see this line a lot. How could Lucas deface work that won an Academy Award? To which I ask, have these people seen what wins Academy Awards? Okay, the Academy Awards are a self-promotion tool for the film industry. Not that no good work has ever won an Academy Award, but they're primarily concerned with industry politics of the year at hand, and the choices always age poorly. Go through the history of Best Picture winners from Academy Awards, and you can count on one hand the times a truly deserving movie has ever been given that prize. There are some good movies that have won Best Picture, but even in those cases, there are almost always other movies from that same year that have become vastly more highly regarded with time than the winner is. In most of the cases, if you go back a few decades, you'll find that the winners are usually movies that have now been mostly forgotten, in spite of there being several other movies from the same year which are now regarded as masterpieces. The special effects work in the first Star Wars movies was, of course, groundbreaking and impressive for the time. But the idea that because something won an Academy Award, that means that it's beyond reproach is the opinion of a 12-year-old who's just really impressed by watching the show and seeing all the famous people at the Oscars telecast, and who honestly doesn't watch very many movies. I do like talking about all these little differences and changes made to the movies because I like examining the filmmaking of it, and it's interesting to compare the different versions. But now I think I've gone over the most interesting small changes, and I made my point that most of the stuff that keeps people like Drew Stewart awake at night is incredibly trivial stuff. But of course there are some larger changes to the movies though, so now I'm going to move on to those, and I think that the reasoning behind getting upset over those large changes makes even less sense than getting upset over the small changes.
Well, the Java Palace musical number was always meant to be a large number, and when we shot it, we ran out of time shooting, and many of the creatures that we had that were going to be in that sequence weren't as mobile and weren't as articulate as we'd hoped. Therefore, the scene ended up getting truncated considerably down to a little tiny musical number. So it was one of those things that I'd always wanted to have this musical number in the film, and it just never got. It just didn't end up being a musical number. It ended up being a little, a couple of bars, and that was it. Before we had Cy Snoodles, and she wasn't very articulate. She couldn't move, her lips wouldn't move, and her eyes didn't move. So now we've got a Cy Snoodles that actually moves around and is a real character. And we've added a Yuzum, Joe Yowza, who is a counterpoint musically to what she is doing. And in the process of changing the music to be a little more bluesy, a little bit more interesting as far as something that's musically more interesting. than what we had in there before. I was able to add backup singers, more horn players, some drummers, and those kinds of things to make it much more lively and a bigger musical number.
Max Rebo's band became an unusual focus for George Lucas.
They're just a whim that George has really pursued and has seemed to really be interested in and has a lot of fun with, although they occupy one line in the script that says something like, and then the band started up.
I think I'd count the change to the musical number in Jabba's Palace as a major change because it's a whole additional couple of minutes, and also the footage before and after it has been re-edited to integrate it into the movie. But it's not a change in the way that people seem to think that it is.
He changed the musical number to like this upbeat kind of like pop rock song.
Now you're really hitting my buttons, right?
Jabba's Palace is a dingy, dark, depressing place, and you can't have like and it's.
Somehow over the years people have developed this idea that Jabba's Palace was originally so much darker and scarier. This is based on how the movies seemed to them as kids, I think. But also, part of the problem going on here is that a lot of people demanding the original versions don't really remember them that well. Somehow in their childhood memories, they have this idea that this scene with a little blue elephant playing keyboard and a stick puppet with lipstick was really dark and serious originally. But I mean, take a minute to actually look at what the scene was originally like. There was nothing silly or funny at all about a yellow puppet dancing to that musical number, but a CGI yellow alien dancing to a similar musical number is suddenly just not mature enough for this serious moment. I remember how the Jabba scenes were scary to me as a kid, too. I thought the Rancor stuff especially was scary, but it's obviously not markedly different in terms of tone now than it was originally. In their videos, Red Letter Media seemed to really struggle with the idea of tone in these movies, in spite of them also trying to lecture Lucas on tone.
Anyway, with these fucking Star Wars prequels, I'm always forced to go back to screenwriting 101. And a big 4-letter word that comes to mind. Fuck. Now, I'm just kidding. The word is tone. And for those of you who don't understand what I'm saying, tone is how a movie feels.
I talked about this in the first part of this video series also, that Red Letter Media simultaneously complains that the prequels are too kid-friendly, and also that Revenge of the Sith is too dark and violent for kids. A lot of the times when people are arguing about these changes to the movies, they're arguing with a fictional version of George Lucas that exists in their head, rather than looking at things that he's actually said and trying to engage with what he's actually done. Red Letter Media in particular feels free to just completely invent or misquote or misconstrue quotes from Lucas in order to try to make it seem like he's saying whatever they'd like him to be saying. They're either too slow to understand what he really said or intentionally misquoting him to try to make him look stupid.
He describes things like a simpleton. Like he's talking about, he's like, well, in the other films we've only seen 2 people fighting with lightsabers. Now we see lots of people with lightsabers. Oh. And that's like a direct quote, like verbatim. And that's how he's describing his film. And you're like what, does he have is he the mind of a child?
This clip here is a good example because Mike here is specifically using this to try to paint Lucas as being stupid. But the problem is that he's not saying what Lucas actually said. Here's the actual quote that Mike is referencing.
Having sort of level 1 of the sword fight with Obi-Wan, I then needed to progress to level 2 with Anakin, because each time we have a sword fight, it's got to get more intense and more intense. And so he came up with this idea of having Obi-Wan throw Anakin his sword so that he could fight with 2 swords for a little bit. And then I had Anakin cut a cable so I could do it in the dark. And I wanted to do a kind of go back to my old roots of a visual sequence, just a kind of a tone poem of lightsabers moving through dark and making it more of a visual idea than a action fighting idea.
I know where this quote is from, because I actually used the same quote in my previous video, because what Lucas is getting at here is the impressionistic way that he was filming and editing some of these fight scenes in Attack of the Clones, and how he was going back to his roots as an abstract filmmaker, making what he likes to call tone poems. It's an interesting quote because it goes into Lucas's thinking and his beginnings as an experimental filmmaker. Of course, I think that all that stuff is kind of over Mike's head, though. So what Mike takes away from this quote is Lucas talking about the number of lightsabers in the scene, and he assumes that the part of the quote that he didn't understand must just be Lucas talking nonsense talk. When it comes to the tone of the movies, their assumption about Lucas's intentions are equally free from any connection to what Lucas has actually said on the topic.
He said before, like, Star Wars was just like a silly sci-fi movie he made in the 70s.
Another aspect of these films that sometimes gets lost is that these films are vaguely lighthearted in terms of the fact that they don't take themselves that seriously. Try to be very realistic in everything, but mostly it's, to have a rip-roaring adventure and a good time. Sometimes people, try to put more into them than should be there, or write them off as of no consequence, but the reality, I think, is somewhere in the middle. When Star Wars came out, everybody said, oh, it's a silly movie, it's just a bunch of space battles and stuff. It's not real. There's nothing behind it. And I said, well, there is stuff behind it. It's not just a space battle. There's more to it than that. It's much, much more complicated than that. But nobody would listen. So they just said, oh, it's simple, and we like the spaceships, we like the stuff. This started out as a kind of experiment. I wanted to do something in the Saturday matinee serial genre. And that was one of my inspirations. I wanted to have the kind of experience that I had when I was a kid, when I was like 12 years old, and I watched Flash Gordon and Don Winslow of the Navy. And so I came up with this idea. I actually came up with two of them. One was Indiana Jones, one was this. And but this one sort of lent itself to another idea I had, which was to take mythic motifs, psychological motifs from a few thousand years ago, and see if they still worked, see if people still cared about the same issues, about their parents, friendship, society, all these sorts of things. And when the movie came out, everybody said, oh, it's fantastic, it's all about special effects, that's why everybody wants to see it. I said, that has nothing to do with it. It really does have to do with the story, the psychological underpinnings, and the fun characters. They said, oh no, the characters are terrible, the dialogue's lousy, the plot is simplistic. It can't be that, it's got to be just the special effects. I said, okay, go ahead. And obviously after that they made about 500 bad special effects movies that were boring as hell. And nobody seemed to have still, even today, they don't seem to get it. But I have given you the secret, so hopefully you can go out and make a nice, interesting fantasy, science fiction, and or contemporary movie that's based on very strong psychological underpinnings.
Lucas has said many times that Star Wars is for kids, that it's supposed to be fun and lighthearted, but he's never said that it's just a silly movie without any meaning. Lucas has talked many, many times about this, explaining that the films are based on things like Flash Gordon and that they're for children, so there's supposed to be a certain light tone, but that doesn't mean that they can't be thematically complicated and deal with serious issues beneath the surface. I talk a lot in the previous video about how one of the basic ideas of Star Wars is to take meaningful mythological stories and then dress them up in a somewhat campy Flash Gordon aesthetic to make it entertaining. This is kind of like, Star Wars 101 kind of stuff, but of course Mike kind of struggles with it. This is all relevant because it also explains why there being a musical number in Jabba's palace doesn't mean that it can't also be a scary sequence for kids. If as a kid I could see the original scene with Max Rebo's band and still find the Rancor scary, I'm sure there's no reason now that kids would have it ruined for them by a musical number that isn't any sillier than what was already there.
I love that. It's great. Good. So, because it's not over the top, eh? No, you can't be over the top in this movie, please.
But what's really weird and inexplicable about this imaginary Lucas that people argue with in their heads is how they think that he's somehow malicious or indifferent when he's making these changes.
It just shows that he doesn't know what's happening in the scene.
Yeah.
or with the characters.
Or doesn't
it's
care.
amazing.
Or doesn't care what's really happening in the scene.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, what possible reason could Lucas have for going back and filming a whole new musical number for the movie unless he cared about it and it was something that he wanted in the movie? I mean, do you think that there was anybody besides Lucas who would have been upset if the new musical number wasn't in there? Until he added it, he's the only person that could have ever noticed that it was missing. I really like it when people say that he's doing all these changes for money. I mean, really, like, what's the financial incentive to adding moss to the rooftops of buildings on Kashyyyk for 2 shots? How many people do you think out there might have been saying, I refuse to buy the Blu-ray until there's some moss on those buildings? I mean, obviously, the only reason that Lucas could possibly have for making a change like that is if it's something that made a difference to him personally. And as soon as you try to think of it from that perspective, you can figure out the possible reasons immediately. Another change that I think of as a large change, and which I guess some people find contentious, would be Hayden Christensen's appearance as Anakin's Force Ghost in Return of the Jedi. Of course, when people complain about this, they don't say that they don't like it for emotional reasons and because they don't like a prequel reference in there. What they try to say is that it's bad storytelling and that it's confusing and doesn't make sense. Why would his ghost look like his younger self when Obi-Wan's ghost looks like Alec Guinness? And, comments like that. This is another case where I'm not sure if people are being willfully obtuse or if they actually are too dumb to understand something that's really simple and it's explained in dialogue in the film.
You told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father.
Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed.
This little scene where he burns his father's body, it wasn't originally in the script. But I decided it gave more closure in terms of Luke's relationship to his father and letting go of his father. And even though later on, as we get to the end of the movie, as he joins the Force, he is able to retain his original identity. It's because of Obi-Wan and Yoda who learned how to do that, how to join the Force at will and then retain your identity. But it was his identity as he was when he died, as Anakin Skywalker.
As Obi-Wan says, when Vader was seduced by the dark side, Anakin was destroyed. So when he told Luke Vader murdered Anakin, what he said was true from a certain point of view. So Anakin's ghost, naturally, would look like Anakin looked when he died, just as Obi-Wan and Yoda's ghosts do. It's also a nice little, visual cue that he was redeemed and that he went back to who he was before he was twisted by the dark side and more machine than man and all of that. A couple years ago, I was dating somebody who had never seen Star Wars before in his life, and so I was able to run an experiment on him and show an adult person all of the movies in the 1 through 6 chronological order. When he saw it, he didn't notice almost any of the special edition changes other than the obvious special effects that were done with technology beyond what was available in 1977. One change that he did notice, though, was Anakin being in Episode 6, since obviously Hayden Christensen wouldn't have been that age in 1983. After the movie, he asked me if it was a new shot. I said no, that was an old shot, but it used to be the actor who played the older version of Anakin. Curious how somebody who wasn't versed in all of the supposed controversy around the change would take it, I asked him why did he think that Lucas would want Anakin's ghost to look like that. My ex said, without pausing to consider it, well, he would look like that because Anakin died when he became Darth Vader, right? So, I mean, that's how, confusing the change is. People who don't know a single thing about Star Wars can figure out the reason for it in all of 5 seconds. And, if I'm being honest, this ex-boyfriend of mine wasn't even very bright. So, I mean, all the fan outrage because it's supposedly a bad change and it will supposedly confuse people and it supposedly doesn't make sense, is that actually the reason? Or, could it just possibly be because they don't like the prequels and it pisses them off to see a prequel actor in the movie? I wonder, which do you think it could be? Of course, I can't have all this talk about the merits of the individual changes in the movies without eventually addressing the McClunky within the room. In the obvious effort to fine-tune the editing and make it flow a little more smoothly, there have been minor changes to this moment in the movies in all the major releases since the 1997 special edition. Fans go over each of these versions literally frame by frame, looking at the details of the changes like it's this Zapruder film. This little moment has become like a flashpoint for all the outrage over Lucas's tinkering with the movies. And yet I think the amazing thing is, if you really think about it for 2 seconds, this change is barely a change at all. The reason fans obsess over this change, as they'll tell you themselves, is that it could be seen as changing Han Solo's story arc. The difference between him shooting in self-defense and murdering Greedo in cold blood could be said to completely change who Han is as a person when we first meet him, and thus also change the journey that the character goes on. The thing is, they never understood the movie in in the first place if they think that?
Well, the change in the Greedo scene, it's always been a little difficult exactly how Han shoots Greedo and how Greedo, what Greedo does to provoke that. I mean, obviously, the situation was that Greedo's going to shoot Han outdraws him and kills him. But in the film, it sort of appeared that Han shot him without Greedo knowing what was going on. And that was always bothering me. So we added a new shot, a wider shot, where you can see Greedo fire his gun and have it ricochet off the wall, and then Han shoots him. So it doesn't look like Han shoots him in cold blood. And we did have some difficulty in the timing of the laser, so it looks believable that Greedo could have fired the gun and then Han would have fired shortly thereafter, but still have it be far enough apart to read as for an audience to see that there are two separate gunshots going on.
Yes, I bet you have.
McClunky. It was always meant that Greedo fired first. And in the original film, you don't get that too well. And then there was a discussion about, well, it's good that it's left amorphous and everything, but I basically, in terms of Han's character and everything, I didn't like the fact that when he was introduced, the first thing he did is just gun somebody down in cold blood. That wasn't what was meant to be there. And the other issue, and again, it's a perception issue, when you're doing something like this, we had 3 different versions of that shot. And one he fires very close to when Han fires, and one was 3 frames later, one was 3 frames later. And we sort of looked at it and tried to figure out which one would be perceivable, but wouldn't, wouldn't look corny. And it's very hard to do that because, I mean, obviously if you know the film real well and you're looking for that, you see it. If you don't know the film very well and you're just watching the movie, it almost goes right by you. You don't even, it's just, there's a lot of things going on. People don't perceive what's happened there, even now. So it's trying to find that medium ground, and it's always this way in film, of what can the majority of the audience perceive and what can't they perceive. And one of the things that I do and I like, but that accusations have been made about, is I like fast-paced movies and I like things to go by in a very almost surreal way. And so, I'm caught between doing things that work for me with, really understanding and seeing something and understanding what's going on. And the audience, which I know is looking at something for the first time, and things go by in a very different way. And so there's always this conflict about where you draw the line. And perhaps I should have done it 2 frames sooner.
Yes, I bet you have. I bet you have. Yes, I bet you have. Yes, I bet you have. Yes, I bet you have.
McClunky.
Who shot first?
Yeah.
Who gives a shit? You got to admit, it's what's called super nerd nitpicking over something that's not really that important.
It's not geeky nitpicking. When you go into the heart of a character and you do something which changes that character's dynamic, that's not nitpicking, that's destroying story. That's betrayal.
So yes, it's a small change, but it's a change that is informing the whole character.
Han has always shot Greedo in self-defense because in all versions of the scene, Greedo was always intending to shoot Han. He says so in the dialogue. Whether or not Greedo actually manages to pull his trigger in time, his intentions and Han's intentions are the same in every version of the scene, and Han is always acting in self-defense. Greedo always means to kill him. So if it doesn't change anything, then why add the extra shot, you ask, right? Well, again, if you think about the way that Lucas is making these movies, it really should be very obvious. Lucas has said countless times that he wants Star Wars to operate like a silent movie, meaning that the necessary information is there in the visuals. This is why kids can respond to the movies emotionally without understanding everything that the characters are saying and all the more complicated things in the movies. And it's also why people who don't speak English can watch the movies in English and still understand them.
Star Wars was originally intended to be based as a visual film. I'm a big fan of silent movies. I have been since I was in school. And so in my mind, I was making a kind of abstract visual film, very much like my first film, THX, very much like my second film, American Graffiti. They're more visually oriented, and they're silent films with a soundtrack, with music, basically. I'm very keen on the soundtrack. I feel it's part of the movie, but I see the soundtrack as basically an accompanying score, even if it's sound effects or dialogue or whatever. It's just part of the accompanying score or the chorus or whatever. So when I did Star Wars, I was still in that mode. I still wanted to do it that way. I wanted to make it be kind of a silent film. And in a silent film, the score, the soundtrack is extremely important in telling the story.
Again, I talk about this particular idea a lot more in my other video, but this entire idea is a fundamental part of what Star Wars is and how it works and why it's so effective for people in a visceral way. In terms of the Han and Greedo scene, though, what this means is that while the information that Greedo was about to shoot Han is there in the subtitles, it wasn't there in the visuals, which means that people who couldn't read the subtitles wouldn't know it, and that even for people who did read the subtitles, visually it wasn't conveyed the same way the dynamics of other scenes were. So Greedo needs to get a shot off so that you can see his intentions. The funny thing about people saying that the change to the scene is unnecessary is that while saying that the scene shouldn't be changed, they're simultaneously proving Lucas right in his belief that it did need to be changed, because the fact that they don't understand that Han was always acting in self-defense means that until the change was made, they didn't understand the scene. So obviously the change was necessary in order for the point to come across to them. And anyway, if they're really concerned with Han having a character arc where he develops from a shady character into a better person, in the end he's still a drug dealer when they first meet him. So how much more fucking obvious does it need to be that he's a flawed person in the beginning? He's a smuggler and a drug dealer, but these people think his character flaws aren't obvious enough unless he's also a murderer. As often happens with people complaining about stuff like this in the movies, what they're actually asking for is Lucas to make a much dumber, less subtle movie than the one that he actually made, and they would consider it an improvement if he dumped it down for them. The reason that they cling to something like Han shooting first instead of something like the changes to special effects is because they think that this change could be said to be about changing a character and changing the story. So they think that it shows that their interest in the original versions of the movies is about their, deep understanding of the characters and story arcs, as opposed to being what it's really about, which is about them wanting the movies to always look the same way that it looked when they were 6. But by calling this a change to Han's character when it actually isn't, they're showing that they're still struggling to understand something that most 6-year-olds don't actually struggle with. As I keep saying, and as I think I've demonstrated by now, it's not that the changes are bad or that Lucas is doing something unusual by changing his work. What it really comes down to is a fight over ownership, and fans believing that eventually an artist is no longer owner of his work if at some undefined point it becomes important enough to the fans that they want to be the owners.
Well, if Da Vinci were able to jump in a DeLorean and go through time and appear today and then tell everyone, on the Mona Lisa, I didn't have the mouth quite right. Well, let me go and repaint some of this. They're not going to let him.
The movie's also about, it deals with issues about like the ownership of the movies and the ownership, like does he have the right to make all these changes, or do the movies belong to the fans?
I mean, the fact that it's been inducted into the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress, I mean, that in itself, I think, means something. It means that it belongs to all of us. It belongs to culture.
Sometimes you have to say the work is finished. It now belongs to the ages.
We want the authors of our texts to be dead and for us to have complete control over them and them not to tell us what to do with it anymore. We like the idea that there are these sort of magical characters who create amazing things and then leave them to us to go find our own way home.
I think an argument could be made that once a film is in the National Film Registry, it belongs to everyone. It belongs to all Americans because it's so important culturally to the United States.
Everyone knows that our culture is going to become more participatory. What's at stake are the terms of our participation. That Lucas and Lucasfilm are going to have to cede more control to the fans if they're going to survive and remain valuable as media properties.
He definitely has a responsibility to film history. Can you get Congress to say, look, you got to hand that over to the Smithsonian now? Probably not, but it would be awesome if it happened.
I think that once you put it out there, you
Because I know
really
what,
are.
think about it. You're putting your stuff out there. Is it yours or is it everyone else's? I think it's shared.
This is an interesting question. Does the public have the right to the materials of its own culture? And I would say yes.
I think anytime you try and improve on anything that becomes that much of a cultural touchstone, you're only going to make it worse. Even if you make it better, you're still only going to make it worse because people, they take ownership of it and they don't want it fucked with.
I think and maybe Star Wars is a unique example of it, but that there is a point where it belongs to culture.
Mm-hmm. No, it's like if Leonardo da Vinci came back to life and said, I'm taking the Mona Lisa and I'm going to put it in my basement and no one can ever see it again. And all images of the Mona Lisa will vanish off the face of the earth.
We would
or
not,
just be low resolution GIF files. But yeah, like.
Who would let him? I mean.
But does he have the right to do that? Would he have the right to do that? Because that's his painting. Yes or no? I mean, no one has an answer.
Yeah. It's funny here that they phrase this question about the Mona Lisa as some kind of unknowable hypothetical brain teaser, since the question actually has both clear moral and legal answers. It's funny, too, that of all the paintings to use as an example, they keep choosing the Mona Lisa, because if they ever bothered to read about it for 5 minutes, they would find out that this particular painting is an especially good example of the opposite of the point that they think that they're making. It's easy to guess why Mike would choose the Mona Lisa as his example, or why Philippe would use that example in his movie. From his comments about film history, it's obvious that Philippe doesn't know a whole lot about art. His other films, besides People vs. George Lucas, are fanboyish documentaries about movies like The Exorcist and Alien and Psycho. And while I love all three of those movies, actually, especially Psycho, you can see from interviews with him that his experience with movies is mostly about these kinds of very famous blockbusters with a very broad cultural impact. Incidentally, all three of those movies that he's made documentaries about also have alternate versions, like the special editions. The Exorcist and Alien both have alternate cuts where the directors made many changes, just like Lucas did with Star Wars, in case I haven't made my point yet about just how common directors changing their films like this is. And with Psycho, at the same time that Philippe was saying to Red Letter Media that the only classic film we don't have the original theatrical version of was Star Wars, the original version of Psycho actually wasn't available either. The original 1960 theatrical version of Psycho was censored on its re-release in 1968, and 3 scenes were changed. Because the negative was altered to conform to these changes, all home video releases of the movie, except for a very limited release only on German TV, were subsequently the censored version of the movie, all the way up until a restored version was included as part of the 2020 60th anniversary release.
And the one classic film that we don't have is Star Wars.
As superficial as Philippe's knowledge of movies is, I'm willing to bet that he and Mike know even less about Renaissance art. And if you ask somebody who doesn't know much about paintings to name one painting, what painting do you think that they would know the name of? So of course that's why they would name the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa. But the reason I say that it's funny that they would choose the Mona Lisa to make this point is that the Mona Lisa that we know today is actually something that could be called a special edition itself. Da Vinci most likely originally painted the Mona Lisa between 1503 and 1506, but evidence leads many scholars to believe that he likely kept working on the painting and changing it all the way until about 1517. Forensic analysis has shown at least 4 different periods of work on the painting, with Leonardo going back to change the size and the detail of her face, the direction of her gaze, and her headdress. At one point, it's possible he was even using a completely different woman as the model for the painting. In addition to that, it also naturally, and through attempts at restoration, has aged and changed over time, exactly as movies do. So you're not seeing the original version when you see the Mona Lisa, just like you're never really seeing exactly the original versions of movies. Analysis and contemporary descriptions show that the Mona Lisa originally had eyebrows and eyelashes, but they're no longer visible, either due to pigments fading over time or excessive cleaning. Paints age and fade, people attempt to restore them, and just like how each time a film is remastered it will look and sound slightly different, this process gradually will accumulate changes to paintings. You can never preserve any work of art exactly as it was, so each restoration effort requires choices as to the best way to treat the work. On top of all that, from sketches and other paintings that have survived, there's evidence that the Mona Lisa might have been Leonardo's second or even third attempt at the same subject, and that the entire painting isn't the original version of what Leonardo was attempting to make. The painting itself is thought to be unfinished, as Leonardo ended up never presenting it to the parties that originally commissioned it. He kept working on it and changing it, and if he stopped in 1517, it was only because his right hand had become paralyzed at that time, and he died 2 years later.
There's a saying among directors that a film is never finished, it's just abandoned. No matter how the story goes, the director is usually left frustrated and not feeling that he's been able to complete his vision, or it's been altered one way or another.
When Lucas says that art is never completed, only abandoned, he's saying something that's been paraphrased by many people, but it's especially funny here if you know where the quote is originally from. Now that I've said that, if you don't know, you can probably guess. Lucas has frequently said variations on this quote to explain his thinking on why he continues to work on his movies, and the quote is usually attributed as being originally from Leonardo da Vinci. You know, the person that Mike and the People vs. George Lucas were trying to use as an example of why Lucas shouldn't change his movies. As to the very dumb question of whether da Vinci would be allowed to change it if he came back back today? Here's the answer. An artist is allowed to change a work up until the time that they sell it or no longer own it. Da Vinci never stopped working on it until he was physically unable to work on it anymore, and it's believed that it was then given or bequeathed to his apprentice, who then sold it to the French King Francis I. At the point that it was owned by his apprentice or by King Francis, it would have been their choice as to whether or not Da Vinci was allowed to continue to alter it. After Francis had it, through a long series of sales and inheritances, after the French Revolution, it was owned by the French Republic, and it's now owned by the state, and French law prohibits them from selling it. Our inheritance laws don't account for people coming back from the dead, since that doesn't happen, but the provenance and ownership of the painting after it was sold to Francis is clear, so that's why if at some point during that history Leonardo had been alive again, he would have needed permission from the painting's current owner in order to physically alter it. It's because the physical object was legally sold to new owners that he wouldn't be allowed to change it, not because of some vague notion by Star Wars fanboys that since they bought a lot of Star Wars action figures, that means that they now also own a piece of George Lucas's art. Morally, if Leonardo hadn't lost his ability to paint and he hadn't died and he hadn't sold or given away the painting, no matter what other people feel about it, it would be his to work on as long as he pleased, which is exactly what he did do all the way until the end of his life when he was no longer physically able to.
No one has an answer.
The answer to when does art suddenly belong to the public because they decide it's important to culture is never. The art never stops belonging to the artist unless they choose to sell it. As long as the artist is alive, they should have the right to do whatever they want with their own work. Even long after the artist is dead and the work becomes public domain, if another person comes along and decides to make changes to it, that changed version is a derivative work, not this new standard version of the work itself. What people like Harmy are doing with something like the despecialized edition is vandalism. It's fan fiction. The idea that they have some sort of moral entitlement to make their own version of the movie because they think that it belongs to some vaguely defined public more than it does to George Lucas is insane. And it's amazing that they routinely say stuff like that without being able to hear how insane it actually sounds. At this point, of course, Lucas has sold the rights to Star Wars, both the copyright and the rights to the original negative, to the physical film itself. But the idea that this means that it can now be released in a version that he doesn't approve of is equally diluted to the idea that the public owns it. As Lucas has said many times, he firmly believes that even if a corporation later buys the right to a work of art, that doesn't mean that they have any right to change it. When asked about whether or not Disney could release the earlier versions of the movies, Kathleen Kennedy wouldn't elaborate on exactly why, but she said that they can't release those versions and said that the Star Wars movies Lucas made will always be his.
Is there like a contractual or a handshake agreement that the films are locked in their current form? Like the special editions and that sort of thing?
Oh, I haven't touched those. Are you kidding? Those will always remain his.
Would you, as a fan, like to see the theatrical versions made available commercially?
Yes, and I have asked about this.
Really?
Because who wouldn't want to see that? But I've been told that for reasons that I don't quite understand, that that's not necessarily possible.
Lucas might have sold his company in his movies, but I think it's obvious to anybody who thinks about it for a moment that he wouldn't have done so without provisions as to how the movies were to be presented in the future. I think it's abundantly clear that whatever deal Lucas made with Disney specifies very clearly what they are and aren't allowed to do with his 6 Star Wars movies. And I say good for him. As much as I'd like to see the original ending to The Shining or those 19 minutes missing from 2001, if somebody found a copy in a warehouse somewhere and tried to put those scenes back into the movie, knowing how clearly against that Kubrick was, it would be a moral outrage. My selfish desire to see a movie that I like doesn't supersede the rights of an artist over his own work, and it's completely childish to feel that way. As adamant as I am in this argument, I'm also a completist and a nerd about movie history and also, of course, a Star Wars fan. If there was a release produced with Lucas's permission that had all the alternate versions of Star Wars and all the deleted scenes, I'd buy that in a minute. But it's also hardly killing me to live without that. All of that stuff has been thoroughly preserved by fans. You can find just about all of it with a quick YouTube search or even in this video. So what have we lost, really? Let's say that tomorrow they did produce that release with the original version of Star Wars, and aging nerds who have spent 25 years whining about the special editions finally have their dream come true. When their nephew wants to watch Star Wars for the very first time, their weird uncle can sit them down and insist that instead of those terrible special editions, little Jimmy can now watch the real Star Wars the way it was meant to be seen. The way their sad, weird, aging uncle saw it back in 1977 when they were little Jimmy's age. What is that nephew gonna get out of that exactly? Do you think that they're gonna grow up and say, oh, thank God my weird uncle showed me the real Star Wars and not the terrible special edition? edition. I mean, obviously little Jimmy won't know the difference unless he spots some really old dodgy special effects in a few places, or if he thinks to ask why the Emperor is played by an old woman for one scene before returning to being played by Ian McDiarmid. I'm sorry if this upsets people, but Lucas has already won. For the majority of people, the original versions of Star Wars aren't anything more than a historical curiosity, exactly as Lucas predicted. There's this notion that there's some kind of vast public outcry for the original versions of the Star Wars movies, and it's another one of the ideas in Drew Stewart's article I was talking about, which has no basis in reality, but which is very popular among Star Wars fans. As evidence of this, Drew cites the fact that when you look at the comments section in articles about releases of the movies, there will always be people asking for the original versions of Star Wars and threatening not to buy the new release if the original versions aren't included. But I mean, at this point in human history, have we really not figured out that the people who like to sound off in the internet comment sections are not a representative sample of the whole population? What percentage of people out there do you think might have bought a new version of Star Wars but refused because it wasn't a recreation of the theatrical version of the movie? Do you suppose that the purists are actually a large enough group of people that they impact the profitability of Star Wars in any way? Not only are they a small minority of aging fans, let's be honest, in spite of whatever grand declarations they might have made in some comment section on the internet, you know full fucking well that they all bought the new 4K versions of Star Wars, or at least watched them on Disney Plus anyway. Drew insists that the new versions of the movies simply aren't the same movies as the real versions, but obviously most fans are barely even cognizant of the differences. And if you are interested in the differences, but also manage to have a knowledge of art outside of one kid's adventure serial, then you know that saying that the special editions aren't the same movie is as silly as saying that a copy of The Hobbit you buy today isn't really The Hobbit, or that the Mona Lisa that you see as it currently exists isn't really the Mona Lisa. Obviously, it's the same piece of art. What we really need to do is stop using the special edition designation. There's really no such thing as a Star Wars special edition, any more than there is a single original version of A New Hope. The term special edition was a marketing designation to convey to people that the movies had been cleaned up and improved for their 1997 theatrical re-release, to help people who had already seen the movies get excited to see them again. But all these terms, like when on home video they talk about director's cuts or extended editions, are ultimately marketing strategies to explain to customers what they're getting and convince them to buy more than one version of the same movie. We don't call Kubrick's edited versions of The Shining or 2001 special editions. They're just the movie. They're not an optional version of it. The releases of the Star Wars movies haven't been labeled as special editions for decades now. They're simply the movies, in the director's preferred versions as it should be. The label of special editions persists from a fan effort to differentiate between the versions they want and the versions they don't want, and in order to label the director's preferred version as in some way less valid than an old draft of the movie. It's a misnomer. It's an artifact of a theatrical reissue of the movies from 25 years ago, and it's a distinction that, for all but a certain aging segment of the fan base, doesn't really exist. But then again, hey, maybe you're the weird uncle whose nephew really gets it, and one day you'll hear him say, wow, the other kids at school saw a version where Greedo gets a single shot off, therefore they had an entirely different understanding of Han Solo as a character than I did, but I knew the real story thanks to my weird old uncle who is still living in 1977. God bless you, weird old uncle. Hey, you never know, it could happen. Keep living the dream, Star Wars fans. Keep living the dream.
Double Darth Vader. Abyss Zulu, Master Luke. Raznan Yamiku Yakobo Munaka. Vindo Maki Maki Wazana Chewbacca. Kobo Chaka Louie, Naki Mani Wea. Boto Waka Nick Rizana Princess Leia. Nuki Waka Chobi Funa Hundu Waka Zoo. Bichi Kiki Waki Waki R2.